The girl, with a confused face, tries to understand how everything came to this, feeling the growing tension around her. The two men have their heads down, beads of sweat are visible on their faces. They are clearly concerned about what is happening. One of the men is trembling with fear, his face and posture revealing internal tension. People gathered around a long table in the luxurious hall, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The atmosphere is so tense it feels like it could be cut with a knife, and one of those present swallows with difficulty. The man, seeing that the emperor was swinging his sword at him, began to beg him to give him a chance. But the prayers were not heard, and the scarlet blood splashed, touching everyone present and the girl who was sitting with her eyes closed. There is blood everywhere, even on the face of the emperor, who was the cause of its appearance. The man sitting on the other side looks at His Majesty in horror. His legs in black boots begin to shake violently with fear because he understands that he could be next. The emperor, with a wild look, raises his sword again, the blade of which is covered in blood. In fear, the man falls from his chair, and His Majesty puts a sword to his head. Everyone at the table is scared because it might be their turn next. They look at the girl who stands behind the emperor, their eyes begging her to save them. The girl is perplexed. She does not understand why everyone is looking at her, because she too does not want to die. And the emperor, at this time, slowly ran his hand over the neck of the lying man, leaving a bloody scratch there. The girl, clenching her skirt into a fist, understands that no one but her can stop His Majesty. She is afraid, she closes her eyes and knows that if she does not stop the emperor, he will take another life. And then, the girl resolutely stands between His Majesty and the man, covering him with herself. Her hand falls on the emperor's hand, which holds the sword, and lowers it. Then the girl hugs His Majesty and asks him to try to calm down. The emperor's eyes are full of madness. He hears her request, but does not understand what she is saying. And then the girl put her hand on His Majesty's forehead and said in a calm voice that everything was fine, that everything would be all right. The man seems to lose strength from this touch. His head falls on the shoulder of the girl who is hugging him. Everyone present looks at this with relief, realizing that the emperor's latest attack of rage has passed and they remain alive. And His Majesty lies down on the floor, his head on the knees of a girl who is thinking about what she must do to live another day. But at first she didn't believe it, and denied that she was inside the novella. And then she became the emperor's secretary, not knowing that in fact he was a tyrant. The girl didn't even think that she would have to sacrifice herself to pull him out of his murderous haze. Taking a breath from these thoughts, she decided that she really wanted to quit this job. After all the girl wanted was to become a highly paid secretary, but right now she wants to leave His Majesty and does not understand how she ended up in such a life. Having thought about all this, the girl called the servants and asked them to accompany the emperor to his chambers. At that moment, she remembered the day of her interview for the position of imperial secretary. Then, the girl could have remained the duke's secretary, but she wanted more. Getting out of the carriage, she approached the coachman and, deciding that he did not need to wait for her, let him go. The girl then approached the guard and said that she had come for an interview for the position of imperial secretary. The guard asked her to wait, and the girl, having passed through the gate, thought that the right hand of the most influential person in the empire should have a much higher salary. Standing next to the fountain, she realized that this could bring her closer to creating a shelter for abandoned children. At this time, a man came out of the palace doors and called Miss Ronaldina. When the girl noticed him, he asked her to follow him with a smile. Walking through the corridors of the palace, he introduced himself as the Minister of Finance, UCL Waidenet, and then added that after the interview, she could immediately begin work as a personal secretary. Hearing the words that she would be a personal secretary, Miss Ronaldino froze in shock. After all, the current emperor of Evern, Daron Venkenradis, has a strong reputation because he turned the kingdom into a great empire. The girl enthusiastically replied that it would be an honor for her to become His Majesty's personal secretary. At that moment, for some reason, she had a feeling of déjà vu, and the Minister of Finance suddenly asked Miss Ronaldina if he could ask her a few questions. Surprised by these words, the girl answered positively. They walked along the corridors of the palace and Uciel asked the girl questions, and she answered them. After the questions were over, the Minister of Finance smiled and remarked that she was very knowledgeable, and he was surprised that she answered all the questions with ease. Smiling back at him, Ronaldine replied that it had distracted her from her upcoming interview. Hearing these words, the Minister of Finance looked at Miss Ronaldina with a smile. and then he surprised her greatly by saying that she had passed the interview, but the final word would be His Majesty's. Then he went to the door and told the emperor that he had been behind it, that he had brought the pretender. The girl couldn't believe that the Minister of Finance was talking about the emperor. And Yusil, looking at Miss Ronaldina, smiled broadly and advised her not to be afraid of His Majesty. After wishing her all the best, the man left, leaving her in front of the open doors into the dark hall. The girl looked at him with bewilderment and timidly decided to go into the hall. In it, on the throne, in a ceremonial uniform with an order, sat the emperor with a pensive look. Entering the hall, the girl curtsied and greeted the highly respected panther of their empire. The thoughtful emperor, resting his chin on his hand, allowed Miss Ronaldine to raise her head. Then His Majesty, lowering his hand, looked closely into the girl's eyes. The moment their eyes met, a memory popped into the girl's head. With icy eyes, Darren Venkanradis looked down at those who stood before him. His hair was black as ink, like the deep sea at night, and his golden eyes glowed with ruthlessness. Remembering all this, Miss Ronaldina looked at the emperor in shock, wondering if this could be true. At this time, His Majesty silently and intently examined the girl. Seeing this look, Miss Ronaldina felt that her soul was leaving her body. After all, she recognized that murderous look. In the novella, Darren Verkenradis was a tyrant. At that moment, thinking that it was bloodthirsty and deciding that she would not get out of here, she suddenly heard that she was accepted. Not quite understanding what had just happened, the girl looked at the emperor in bewilderment, and he, looking at Miss Ronaldina again, said that she could go. The girl lowered her head and sighed with relief, realizing that she had survived today. Then, going up to the doors and opening them, she hurried out of the hall. Having closed the doors behind her, the girl sank to the floor right next to them, suddenly losing her strength. Seeing Miss Ronaldina leave, the Minister of Finance hurried towards her. While offering his hand to the girl, he asked if she had passed, to which he received a positive answer, and Ronnie also asked if he could ask him a question. Yusil looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she wanted to ask. Miss Ronaldina, closing her eyes, suddenly asked if His Majesty liked killing people around him. Then, with the help of the Minister of Finance's hand, the girl tried to get up. Hearing this question, the man asked if she had heard rumors about the emperor, but Ronnie replied that she simply felt the tension in the air. Yusil smiled and suggested that she was simply intimidated by the emperor's charisma. Miss Ronaldina looked at him thoughtfully, wondering if this was really true. And then I realized that the Minister of Finance was just a terrible liar. Lowering Yusil's hand, the girl suddenly realized that she had now become the tyrant's personal secretary. She didn't have any hard evidence, but judging by the emperor's aura and icy gaze, her intuition told her that this was a terrible idea. The girl, covering her eyes with her hands, thought that she did not want to be beheaded at work, but now she had no way back, and she would not be able to escape. Somehow pulling herself together, Miss Ronaldina found the strength to rise to her feet. The girl also remembered that in the novel there was a female protagonist who calmed the tyrant emperor until they ended up happy. So she decided that everything would be fine because she was an excellent secretary. Having decided that she would stay there until the main character showed up, the girl said that she would start work next week and would try not to be late. Hearing this, Yusil said that this would not work because as a personal secretary, she had to be near the emperor all the time. On her first day at work, the girl sat at her desk in the prince's office and looked at her watch. Holding the pen in her hand, Miss Ronaldina thought that time was passing very slowly. When Yusil entered the office, the emperor stood up and, turning to him, asked where the rest of the documents were. The Minister of Finance handed over the documents to His Majesty, and he began to look through them carefully. While the emperor was busy, Yusil told the girl that she should carefully delve into the intricacies of work in His Majesty's office. Then, approaching the emperor, the Minister of Finance announced that in an hour a meeting would be held to discuss field research within the framework of the upcoming council, to which the emperor was surprised as to why this was necessary, since all he needed was a summary. To this, Yusil replied that he would convey his message, and since the administrative meeting was scheduled for tomorrow morning, he had nothing planned for the afternoon. After this, the man turned to Ronnie and asked if she had heard how he and His Majesty discussed tomorrow's meeting, to which the girl answered positively and asked what needed to be prepared. Yusil, placing a huge stack of paper on the table, calmly replied that she didn't need to prepare anything. She only has to join the meeting as the imperial secretary. The girl was very surprised by this answer, not understanding why he was doing this since he didn't even know her. On the day of the administrative meeting, Miss Ronaldina prepared as best she could. Approaching the doors, the girl stood hesitantly in front of them. Then, with the thought that she would do it, she resolutely reached for the handle and opened the door. When she entered the hall, she saw only one familiar person, the Minister of Finance, who greeted the girl. The man was sitting at the table and there was an empty chair next to him. After wishing everyone a good morning, Ronnie asked Uciel if he wouldn't be sitting next to His Majesty, to which she received a negative answer. As she walked past the others to her seat, they made dissatisfied faces. Sitting next to the Minister of Finance, Ronnie asked if His Majesty would arrive soon. She asked this not just like that, but in order to have time to prepare the documents. Suddenly, with a slight creak, the door to the conference room opened. Hearing this sound, everyone present looked at the entrance and stood up. Indeed, at that moment, the Emperor entered the conference room, adjusting the heavy cloak that lay on his shoulders. When His Majesty sat down at the head of the table, a long and tedious administrative meeting began. Everyone had disagreements about everything, and they discussed one issue for several hours, and the girl took notes throughout the entire meeting. Uciel at some point smiled and advised him to organize the notes he had made, since His Majesty liked it when notes were concise. Ms. Ronaldina thanked the Minister of Finance for his advice and added that she would definitely do so. At this point, suddenly one of those present asked who had made the decision to hire a commoner for the position of secretary, and everyone, without exception, began to discuss the girl, but she understood that she had to remain silent because there was a meeting going on. When someone shouted out that they refused to be in the same room with her, Uciel remarked that they were behaving inappropriately. And the Emperor, looking menacingly at the shouter, remarked, "Weren't they having a meeting, and how dare he speak like that in his presence?" And then, the Emperor suddenly looked at the girl and called her by name. When she looked at him, the man suddenly asked which bill they had put on hold because they had not come to a consensus. When Ronnie replied that it was the Ritai Estate's water supply system project, His Majesty asked her opinion on the matter. The girl thought for a moment, and then replied that the Empire's canals largely depended on the Ravada River, which flowed through the center of the Empire, but the mail in the estate was soft, and this made it difficult to build underground water pipes. When one of those present exclaimed that a simple secretary could know about this, the Emperor ordered her to continue. And Ronnie suggested not relying on the river, but using water flowing from the nearby mountains. After all, they can solve this problem by building an above-ground water filtration station. Ronaldina added that she knows that the Empire relied on the Ravada River from the very beginning, but neighboring states successfully implemented a similar filtration system. After listening to the girl, the Emperor asked those present if anyone had a better idea than the one proposed, and he also added that she had found a solution to what they had been struggling with for a long time, which proved her competence. His Majesty then said that he had chosen her himself and advised the others to stop nagging and focus on the meeting. Ronaldina, however, felt thrown off balance, not understanding how the Emperor could have known that she had a solution to this problem. After this, the meeting moved very quickly, and the girl began to look at the ruler in a positive light. Later, when Ronnie brought the papers, the Emperor, without being distracted from other papers, said to put them on the table. The girl, despite the man, carried out His Majesty's command. Then she asked if he would eat, to which he replied that he was not hungry. Looking at the Emperor, Miss Ronaldina thought that he seemed completely different from the one in the novel. The more time she spent as his secretary, the more she began to wonder why he was considered a tyrant, because in fact, he was far from it. After all, His Majesty's only drawback was that he was a workaholic and tired out the staff, rarely even raising his voice. And there was one more thing that worried her, namely, why the Emperor was constantly drinking some strange potion. While the girl was thinking about this, a maid entered the office and announced that a tailor had arrived to take his measurements. Without looking up from his papers, His Majesty said that he would come in a minute. Ronnie looked at the man with curiosity and thought that she didn't know that trying on clothes was also his job. Looking closely at the Emperor, she decided that he was the face of the Empire, and also always impeccably dressed, always neat and stylish. At that moment, the girl realized that the man noticed her gaze and looked back, which embarrassed her. After the man left the office, she realized she needed to focus on work. But for some reason, the girl couldn't do this and was thinking hard about something. And then Ronnie looked at the Minister of Finance, who was sitting at the table opposite. and he, noticing her gaze, asked if she wanted to ask him about something. The girl suddenly asked if Yusil had a younger sister, to which he answered positively and added that she was much younger than him. Hearing this, Ronaldina continued to look thoughtfully at the Minister of Finance, and then she suddenly asked if he had grown up by chance with His Majesty. Hearing this question, Yusil was very surprised and asked how she found out about it. Smiling, the girl replied that she assumed this when she noticed how close they were to each other. Yusil, noting that His Majesty was quite a frightening man, added that this did not explain where she got the idea that they had known each other since early childhood. Miss Ronaldina explained that it was her intuition, and it had never let her down. Left alone, Ronnie thought that she was sure that this was a fairy tale world, and what she remembered turned out to be quite real. That night, already lying in bed, the girl realized that she was still not sure that she would be able to survive here, and also that if what she read turns out to be true, then His Majesty is definitely a tyrant. The girl understood that in order to survive, she had to remember the whole plot, but unfortunately, in the real world, she had read too many books, and he only remembers for sure that the female protagonist will lead a delegation from a neighboring country. Realizing that this would only happen in 6 months, she realized that thinking about it would not bring anything good. Looking at the shining moon visible from her window, Ronnie decided that she just needed to find a way to stay alive for these 6 months. At this time, the Minister of Finance was walking along the night terrace, which was illuminated by lanterns, and was wondering why Miss Ronaldina had asked him that question. He was also curious whether the girl knew more about His Majesty than she let on, and then he decided that he was wasting his time worrying about it, since it was hard to find someone with talent like hers. He remembered telling the Emperor that Ronaldina was the only candidate for the position of secretary, since His Majesty had forced the others to run away in tears. Moreover, the girl met all the requirements and had excellent recommendations. When the Emperor began to look through Miss Ronaldina's documents, Yusil added that the girl was well informed about current affairs. The Minister of Finance, seeing that His Majesty was in no hurry to give his consent, said that he could not work as treasurer and his private secretary. Remembering all this, Yusil sighed heavily and hoped that Miss Ronaldina would not leave. Morning came. Ronnie woke up and thought that she was beginning to get used to life in the royal palace. Getting out of bed, the girl got dressed and got ready, realizing that they still hadn't sent the promised maid, but she had already gotten used to doing everything herself. Walking down the long corridor, the girl thought that maybe being the Emperor's secretary wasn't so bad. Even though this is a difficult job, the salary for it was promised to be very high. And then the girl noticed a slightly open door to the Emperor's office, and I decided that I had to tell His Majesty that the people wanted an audience. The girl entered the office with the thought that life in the novella was not so bad, and His Majesty is not such a tyrant as he was shown in the novella, and in fact he is quite adequate, and at that moment she froze in horror. After all, there was a dead man lying on the office carpet, and everything around was covered in scarlet blood. Covering her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming in fear, Ronnie froze with her eyes wide open. After all, she saw that the Emperor was standing over the man's body with a bloody sword. And when he swung, the girl realized that she had made up the idea about His Majesty's normality herself. The Emperor lowered his sword and looked at Miss Ronaldina. At that moment, he did not look like himself. The girl, looking at him, knew that she had to run, but she couldn't move. Tears were streaming from her wide-open eyes, but she couldn't look away. The Emperor slowly turned to Ronnie, and she thought that at this rate he would die quickly. But then the man opened his hand and his bloody sword fell out of it. Then the Emperor slowly walked away from the body, leaving behind bloody traces. At that moment, he seemed to wake up and covered his face with his hand, realizing what had happened. Miss Ronaldina closed her eyes in fear as she heard His Majesty say that he had to stop. On the Emperor's desk there were 2 bells. The small one was for calling the doctor. But His Majesty approached the table and took another bell in his hands. After all, this golden bell was needed to call Yusil, and as soon as he rang it, the Minister of Finance immediately came running. He saw His Majesty, who was sitting at the table covering his face with a bloody hand, who asked him to take care of Ronnie because she was in shock. Yusil looked at the girl and saw that she was standing and staring at one point. Approaching her and asking if she was okay, he suggested that the girl go to her room and rest, and he would take care of everything. As he saw Ronnie off, the finance minister added that he was sorry she had to go through this. Having come to her room, the girl lay down on the bed and lay in one position for a long time, without even undressing. When she finally managed to collect her thoughts, it was already well past midnight. Ronnie only now realized that it was terrible, and she didn't think the Emperor was as tyrant as he was portrayed in the novel. Closing her eyes because she was still scared, she decided that this might be a fairy tale world, but right now, this was her reality. Ronnie remembered that when she appeared here after death, she was lying on the street, slowly losing consciousness from cold and hunger. Then the girl understood that very soon she would die again. But her saviors were real, abandoned orphans. They found her lying on the steps and gave her bread to eat. It was with the help of those children that Ronnie found a place where she could stay for a while. But the shelter was located in a slum where scammers used children for their own purposes. Ronnie was an adult trapped in a child's body, but the other children she was with were innocent. Deciding that she needed to do something and realizing that secretaries received high salaries, she stirred up her memories of the past and began to study with all her might. The girl remembered how, at the age of 16, she worked as a baron's secretary. And then Ronnie slowly began to rise until she became the Duke's secretary. It was then that the girl was able to save the children from the orphanage. Ronnie also remembered that when Madonna took her off the streets, she began to dream. Ronnie wanted to have a lot of money to save children not only around her. At that moment, through her sleep, she heard a female voice asking if she was okay. Opening her eyes, Ronnie saw a girl sitting on the bed, and it seemed to her that it was Madonna. But then, looking more closely, Miss Ronaldina realized that it was not her and asked who this girl was. To this, the girl replied that she wanted to arrive earlier, but the advisors could not make a decision, and she was outraged that there were people who made important decisions for them. She was amazed that Miss Ronaldina had beaten everyone to get the job and was very interested to learn about it. And then, remembering her manners, the girl introduced herself as Lady Melvin Medela and added that she would be her maid of honor. Then the girl, seeing that Ronnie needed a bath, insisted on preparing it herself. When the girl was combing Miss Ronaldina's hair after the bath, she said that she had heard that an unpleasant incident had recently happened to her. When Melvin asked about the fact that Miss was probably scared now, Ronnie replied that she thought that the palace was the safest place in the empire. And then she added that she doesn't want to leave yet because she worked hard to reach such heights, and the salary is very good. The girl said that she wants to open a shelter for abandoned children. But to do this, she needs a lot of money, and the Emperor's secretary is the highest-paying job she could find. Hearing this, Melvin, with a sparkle in her eyes, replied that everything would be fine, because she now had her. And also, the maid of honor knew everything about court rumors and gossip. In fact, Melvin was actually helpful. She kept Ronnie on such a tense state that she didn't have time to process what had happened. Night fell, and the maid of honor, leaving Ronnie's room, wished her good night, and the girl realized that thanks to her efforts, she felt better. Smiling back, Miss Ronaldina hoped that now everything would get better. And the Emperor, at this time, stood on the balcony, and his gaze was fixed on the night sky, where the moon was shining. A few days later, Ronnie was walking down the hallway, thinking about how she hadn't known His Majesty was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. She remembered that Uciel had told her that the Emperor suffered from nightmares caused by childhood trauma, and when the symptoms worsened, hallucinations appeared, causing his view of the world to become distorted. His Majesty takes medicine to perform his duties efficiently, but she caught him at an inopportune moment when the medicine's effect wore off. When the girl asked if he needed to increase the dosage, Uciel explained that the medicine was made from poisonous herbs, it was harmful to the body, and the Emperor took it when he felt that its effect was beginning to weaken. When she entered the office, Ronnie realized that he was having a hard time understanding when the medicine was starting to wear off, and she also really didn't want to be alone with him. Standing at the threshold of the office, the girl suddenly realized that there was no one in it. This surprised Miss Ronaldina very much, because the Emperor began working very early. Approaching the table and placing the papers on it, the girl, looking around cautiously, asked if there was anyone there. When she decided to walk around the office, she suddenly saw His Majesty lying on the floor and covering his face with his hands. Approaching the Emperor, the girl, overcoming her fear, anxiously asked if he was okay. When she touched the lying man with her hand, he looked at her with a crazy look. At that moment, the girl realized that she was in trouble again. The Emperor stood up abruptly and extended his hand towards Miss Ronaldina, and then he grabbed her by the shoulders, not realizing what he was doing, and Ronnie tried to reach his mind. The emperor, looking at the girl with golden eyes, insisted that it was not him, and that it was not because of him. Miss Ronaldina looked at the man with fear, not understanding what he was talking about. And suddenly, a memory from a novella popped into her head, where His Majesty's mother regretted that she did not have enough time to shower her son with love. She remembered that after these words the Empress's pale hand fell, leaving a bloody imprint on her son's cheek. Remembering all this, the girl realized that the emperor saw his mother in her. And then Rani, thinking that she had not had time to give enough love, timidly placed her hand on His Majesty's cheek. Feeling the gentle touch, tears began to roll from the emperor's eyes, and he quietly called the girl mother. And then he leaned towards her chest and all his strength left the man. Miss Ronaldina did not expect this and was very surprised, and then she felt that she could not hold the limp emperor. At this time, the office door opened and Yusiel's voice was heard shouting that he was late. And upon entering the office, the Minister of Finance saw a girl lying on the floor, and on top of her the emperor, who was unconscious. He was very surprised to find such an unexpected picture, and Miss Ronaldina, trying to get up, sharply asked Yusiel why he was always late. Sometime later, after the emperor had gone to bed, the girl was sitting at her desk in the study. And the Minister of Finance stood in front of her and thoughtfully said that His Majesty had most likely developed an immunity to the medicine, and they would have to look for another drug. Rani, getting up from the table, thought that they would still need to find a way to calm her down. Suddenly, the man suggested that Rani take a week's break. The surprised girl asked if he had the right to do such things, to which Yusiel confidently replied that she needed to rest, and he would take over her responsibilities for that time. Rani, deciding that if she refused he would change his mind, responded positively to this proposal. While on vacation, Ronaldina went to the library to find out what PTSD was. She understood that all this was somehow connected with his mother, and she wondered what had happened in the emperor's childhood. The little emperor ran happily, and the wind fluttered his black hair. He ran along the wooden path towards his mother, confident that she would like what he had prepared. He had flowers clutched in his hand and closed his eyes when he noticed something strange. He saw a large column of blood that seemed to be moving towards him as if it were alive, and in its center there was a bloody rose, from the petals of which blood was dripping. Seeing this, the young emperor froze with his eyes wide open, holding the flowers in his fist, which were beginning to wither. And in the center of the rose sat a beautiful woman in white, and when the boy saw her, he realized that she was his mother. Suddenly the woman jumped off the flower and caught up with the boy, who, frightened, decided to run away. She hugged him from behind, touched his cheek and said that it was all his fault. At this time, the emperor woke up. It was hard for him to breathe, because he was afraid of another nightmare that came to him in his sleep. For some time the man lay in bed, trying to catch his breath and calm down. Then he stood up, got dressed and walked into his office with determined steps. Yusiel, who was busy with paperwork, saw His Majesty and asked if he was okay. The emperor, sitting down at the table, replied that he was not quite well and thought that since the Minister of Finance was here, it meant that he had not been absent for very long. And then the man suddenly realized that someone was missing in the room. Seeing that the secretary's desk was empty, he asked Yusiel where the girl was, to which he heard that he had given her a week's break. Hearing this, the emperor asked the man to repeat what he had just said. And when Yusiel tried to change the subject, His Majesty asked directly why the secretary was absent. Looking down, Yusiel explained that Darren had attacked Miss Ronaldina while he was unconscious, and then he added that she was not hurt. Thinking that he had misunderstood, the emperor asked him to repeat it again. The man couldn't believe he had tried to harm his secretary, and she had taken a week off, and he also realized his hallucinations didn't stop until he saw blood. Yusiel added that he appeared after His Majesty lost consciousness and came when he was already asleep. The emperor could not believe that he had fallen asleep immediately, because it was impossible. And then the man remembered something, how he leaned against Rani's chest and she hugged him. At this time, the girl in the library found out that the emperor's mother was called Lucretia, and she was sad that she could not give her son more love. Ronaldina searched for information slowly and for a long time, but there was no information about His Majesty's childhood anywhere. Remembering the man's tears when she touched his cheek with her hand, the girl wanted to know about his parents. But I realized that there were absolutely no records left about the former king and queen. The girl, putting the books back in their places, thought that either she had searched poorly or all the information had been destroyed, but she did not understand why she had to do this. As a result, Rani spent her entire vacation researching the emperor's past, and when it ended, she returned to work. Seeing His Majesty in his office in his place, she timidly asked how he was feeling today. The emperor, seeing Miss Ronaldina, asked with surprise if she had really returned. His Majesty, holding the document in his hands, looked attentively at the girl. Noticing this look, Rani asked if he wanted her to do something, but received a negative answer. Sitting down at her desk, the girl wondered whether the emperor was worried about her or not. Then she suddenly noticed a stack of documents lying neatly on the table. She was delighted that Lord Wadenet had done everything while she was away. For a while, she heard the emperor and Usiel discussing that they had resolved the issue of the estate and that, as a result, a delegation from Poyern was coming to them. The Minister of Finance approached Miss Ronaldina, who was reading the documents and trying to comprehend what she had heard. Turning to the girl, he asked if she had managed to rest, but she did not answer this question and, showing her documents, asked what it all meant. Usiel didn't quite understand what Rani was talking about and was a little scared, but the girl asked if they really had to receive a delegation from Poyern. Having calmed down, the man replied that this was quite unexpected, but they were sending a delegation to discuss trade with their empire. Having learned that they would arrive in 3 months, the girl excitedly thought that it was a foreign delegation. And in the book, the main character visited Evern during the arrival of a foreign delegation and hoped that perhaps this was it. Suddenly, Miss Ronaldina remembered that Poyern was an island and wondered if the protagonist was from there. At this time, Usiel reminded that it was precisely on this matter that a meeting would be held today and asked His Majesty to prepare for it. Sometime later, when the meeting had already begun, the girl watched the arguing advisors and slowly began to get angry. Everyone present was convinced that they had no need to establish relations with the island of Poyern and that they would gain nothing from it. The debate continued for quite a long time, with everyone expressing their opinion. Unexpectedly, the emperor asked Lord Wadenet what he thought about this, but he did not have time to answer. And then His Majesty sternly said that they could discuss everything when the delegation arrived, but now he was only interested in their opinion. Looking at Usiel, the emperor asked if he agreed with him. Lord Venedet, smiling, answered positively, and Miss Ronaldina also added that she agreed. The girl explained that little was known about this island, since it was closed off from the rest of the world. Rani also added that rare plants and herbs grow there that are not found on the continent, and Poyern uses herbs to develop the medical industry. If they establish connections with them, then medicine will advance greatly, said Miss Ronaldina. The girl understood that this was just an assumption, and that it was not enough to sign the agreement. But she also remembered that some people would grasp at straws for this opportunity. After all, Rani saw how people died from diseases in the slums, and although the elite does not notice this, their empire needs progress in medicine. The girl understood that this would be beneficial for all the people of the empire. After listening to all the opinions, the emperor concluded that the votes were divided and he would wait and see what they wanted to discuss during the negotiations, and declared the meeting closed. As she walked down the corridor with Usiel, the girl thought that everything hadn't gone as expected, and in order to survive, she needed the protagonist to arrive as soon as possible. At this point, Lord Vedenet asked how she knew so much about Poyern. Smiling, Rani replied that she had read a book about the islands, to which the man remarked that although he was an avid reader, he was no match for her. With a grin, the girl noted that he didn't need to flatter her. Arriving at the office and sitting down at the table, Ronaldina was about to begin the next task. And this task became to prepare everything for the Raidus banquet. She remembered how, as she approached the office, Usiel had said that she needed to do something else. Namely, that His Majesty wants to see her so that she can organize the Raidus banquet. Lord Venedet explained that the Emperor knew that Parliament had claims against her, and this was a perfect opportunity to prove them wrong. After the reign of Deran Vercandus, Evern, once a kingdom, became a vast empire and no one dared to go against him. And the neighboring countries send gifts every year in memory of the day when Evern became an empire, and to celebrate this event, the empire holds an annual banquet. After drinking tea, Rani remembered that His Majesty always adhered to simplicity and modesty, and she had not yet organized a tea party in his honor. The girl also thought that the protagonist would arrive immediately after the banquet and did not know what to do after her arrival. Walking down the corridor, Ronaldina thought that the banquet was just around the corner, but she was not mentally prepared for it. The girl was very worried whether everything would go well. She also knew it was too late to back out. Walking down the corridor, Ronnie met Lord Venedette, whom she was looking for. When the girl gave him the papers, the man apologized for dumping everything on her and not helping. To this, Ronnie replied that she understood everything, and that financial management was a much more complex task. Unexpectedly, the girl asked why he thought she was suitable to organize the Radis banquet. To this, UCL replied that Duke Randis treated her with great respect, and thanks to the papers, he could imagine what the banquet would look like, and asked her not to worry. As he said goodbye, the man added that he couldn't wait to see everything when it was ready. Miss Ronaldina let out a tired sigh and watched the Minister of Finance leave, and then, thinking that she still had a lot to do, she went on. When the girl entered her room, she saw Melvin preparing her bed. The maid of honor looked at her mistress with delight and said that they needed to prepare her dress for the ball. She added that she came from a family of fashion designers, and Ronaldine suddenly found herself surrounded by maids. Melvin said her family has been involved in design and owning stores for several generations. She added that she would make the perfect outfit for Ronnie, and the maids, at these words, grabbed the girl by the hands. After Miss Ronaldina had been measured and was sitting exhausted on the sofa, Melvin offered her a choice of clothing styles. The first option was to choose something luxurious, since this was an imperial banquet. The second is to dwell on the image of mystery and innocence. Well, the third is to choose a formal style, since she is His Majesty's secretary, and this will add insight and confidence to Ronnie's image. Looking at Melvin, who was enthusiastically telling all this, Ronnie asked her if she was sure that she would succeed. And so the day of Radis's banquet arrived. The girl slowly walked towards the entrance and hoped that His Majesty was already there. She couldn't help but overhear a conversation in which it was said that the appearance of the Loptis Palace was magnificent, and that it would be a great pity if everything were as miserable as last year. Deciding not to linger any longer, the young people headed towards the entrance, hoping that this would not last too long. But when they entered inside, they were amazed by the sight of the banquet hall, because it was much grander than they had imagined. Melvin, who was also there, was amazed by the statues that were not there before. She remembered this palace because in the past, many luxurious balls were held here. The maid of honor realized that Ronnie had covered the damaged areas of the walls with bright curtains, and that the correctly placed lamps had given the hall an unearthly look. Everyone was delighted, and Melvin, watching and listening to the conversations, heard people saying that the banquet was organized by His Majesty's secretary. Ronaldina herself was very tense because organizing a banquet is not an easy task. And finally, the master of ceremonies announced the emperor, and the man walked confidently into the hall. The girl stood and watched from afar as His Majesty walked through the hall. At that moment, looking at the people, Ronnie clearly realized something, namely, that the emperor was able to win the trust of his people. Ronnie didn't know if he was the formidable tyrant from the novel, the emperor beloved by his people, or a man suffering from childhood trauma. Looking at the man sitting on the throne and the people around him who admired him, she couldn't understand who he was. The emperor, confirming his love of simplicity, simply thanked everyone present for coming. Miss Ronaldina, hearing these words, was surprised by His Majesty's short speech. The invited musicians began to play pleasant music, and the banquet, interrupted by the arrival of the emperor, continued. The girl standing on the balcony looked attentively at the emperor. Suddenly the man noticed the look and looked back, and Ronnie realized she couldn't break eye contact. At this time, the empire's partners approached, and His Majesty turned his gaze to them, which brought relief to the girl. The man who approached the throne bowed and introduced himself as Devon Piff, one of those who served the emperor. Miss Ronaldina, recalling the list of important guests, realized that this marquis was a far-sighted businessman with a rich biography. Then she looked at the girl standing next to the marquis and assumed that she was probably his daughter. Ronnie listened to the man express his admiration for the banquet and realized that he was talking too much. And then the marquis introduced the girl who stood next to him, saying that this was his daughter, Verica Piff. And then the man added that it was a great honor for him to introduce his daughter to His Majesty. Hearing the name Verica, Miss Ronaldina thought that the name was familiar to her and suggested that perhaps she was one of the minor characters in the novella. Marquis Piff, at this time, raised his head and saw that His Majesty's secretary was looking at him. He did not like this, and he decided that she did not know her place. Seeing this hostile look, the girl felt a chill, and the Marquis asked his daughter what this commoner was doing here. Miss Ronaldina heard this conversation because the Piff family was right below her and she felt uncomfortable. so she decided to go downstairs to get lost in the crowd. But suddenly she was surrounded by several young ladies who greeted her. The girls around Ronaldina began to introduce themselves to her with joyful smiles. They surprised Ronnie by asking if she had organized the banquet this year, and then some of them started inviting her over to find out the details. But Ronaldina didn't expect that so many people would pay attention to her. All these looks, friendly smiles, and conversations shocked her a little. One of the girls suddenly grabbed her hands and said that she would send her an invitation. But at that moment, Lord Venedet approached them and gently pulled the girl away from Ronnie. And then, he said to Miss Ronaldine, he had a lot to do and took her with him. The girl went out onto the terrace, the wind played with her hair, and the night sky was beautiful. The Minister of Finance, who followed her, asked Ronnie not to be surprised that she would now be the focus of increased attention and that people would start giving her gifts, or, to be more precise, giving her bribes. He was sure that the girl would handle everything perfectly, but he felt he should warn her. The next day, as Miss Ronaldina was walking down the corridor, a strange young man called out to her. Looking around, the girl realized that it was a foreign minister. The man bowed, complimented the girl, and asked her for help, adding that it concerned the meeting of the delegation from Poyern. Smiling, Ronnie replied that she didn't know how she could help and asked to reschedule the discussion of the request for another time, as she was currently busy. And in the corridor in front of the Emperor's office, the doctor said that the effect of the medicine was becoming shorter and His Majesty's body was becoming more resistant to the drug. Yusiel, who was listening attentively to the doctor, asked about His Majesty's health, to which the doctor replied that his body was absorbing poison. He then added that this medicine is only a temporary measure and not a permanent replacement. Miss Ronaldina, who was standing around the corner and accidentally overheard this conversation, realized that everything was bad and the Emperor could faint at any moment. She remembered that before he lost consciousness the last time, the man said that it was not his fault. And then Ronnie decided that it was none of her business, because she couldn't do anything, and also that she would soon leave. Sometime later, Miss Ronaldina stood in front of the laid table and looked at it carefully. The maids reassured the girl, asking her not to worry, because they had been through this many times. But the girl was worried because the main character was supposed to arrive today. And so, while His Majesty, the Minister of Finance, and Miss Ronaldina were sitting at the table, a delegation from Poyern arrived. Ronnie dreamed that soon she would return to the duchy, because the protagonist was supposed to arrive. She was full of anticipation that her job as a secretary would soon be over. When the delegation entered, the Emperor stood up and greeted the arrivals. Ronnie was waiting for His Majesty and the main character to meet. The head of the delegation at that time introduced himself and greeted the Emperor. And while His Majesty was discussing the export of plants with him, the girl sat in shock, because the head of the delegation turned out to be a man. She couldn't understand where the main character had gone. After all, according to her recollections of the novel, the girl was supposed to be the head of the delegation. The discussions at the table continued, because Evern is a huge country, and many people want to trade with it. Folding his arms across his chest, the Emperor concluded that they really did understand phytology. And then His Majesty thought for a moment and looked at Miss Ronaldina. Seeing this look, the girl asked if His Majesty needed anything. But the Emperor, looking at the secretary again, answered negatively. Soon, one of the seated men stood up and bowed to the Emperor. He then approached the head of the delegation and showed him the trade agreement they had reached and offered to let him review it. When Vahern thanked the Emperor, he asked Lord Clarat to escort the delegation to the Rodovan Palace, and at this time Ronnie did not understand how everything went so quickly and whether she had missed something. The head of the delegation, rising from the table, said goodbye to the Emperor, adding that he looked forward to the opportunity to work with them. And His Majesty, accompanied by Miss Ronaldina, went to the stairs to the second floor. The girl walked, mechanically moving her legs, completely immersed in her thoughts. And suddenly she noticed that the Emperor stopped, and this made her wonder why he did it. Having reached His Majesty, Miss Ronaldina called out to him, and then she noticed how the man covered his face, from which beads of sweat were slowly running, with his hand. At that moment, Ronnie realized with horror that the meeting had lasted longer than it should have, and the girl also understood that if anyone saw them now, they might find out the Emperor's secret, and then one small rumor could spread very quickly. Looking at His Majesty, Ronnie asked if she could help him with anything. Miss Ronaldina began to look around to see if anyone would appear first, and then, unexpectedly, her hand touched the Emperor's hand. His Majesty, feeling this touch, looked at the girl and decided that he did not want to harm her again. Therefore, having answered that everything was fine, the man asked not to touch him and, holding onto the wall, began to climb further. Ronnie, looking at him, thought that she just wanted to help and touched him by accident. At that moment, she heard someone call her. With a nervous smile, the girl turned to see Lord Claret and asked if he was giving their guest a tour. The man smiled and replied that he was accompanying the delegation to the Rodovan Palace. After bowing, Miss Ronaldina wished them a good time. The head of the delegation looked at the smiling girl with interest. In the Emperor's office, the clock ticked quietly, counting down the time. His Majesty sat at the table, trying to control himself and drumming his fingers on the table in time with the clock. When Ronnie entered the office, he asked her to leave the documents on the table. The girl, sitting down at her desk, asked for a little time to finish with the documents. Ronaldina placed a huge stack of written sheets of paper on the table. Then, taking a pen, she began to correct and underline something in them. There was silence in the office, and outside the window the sky was slowly darkening and evening was approaching. Having finished with the documents, Ronnie was surprised because she realized that Sir Vedene did this every month. Holding a piece of paper in her hands, the girl suddenly heard some strange sound. She saw that the Emperor had fallen from his chair and was kneeling near the table, covering his face with one hand. Calling the man by his title, the girl rushed towards him with alarm. Kneeling down next to him, she tried to support him, and then she heard the Emperor ask for Rigot to be called. Ronaldina, standing next to him, understood that now she had to run. However, looking at the Emperor, the girl experienced mixed feelings. That's why she didn't run away, but continued to try to help the Emperor get up. Suddenly, the man rose to his knees and looked at Ronaldina, and then the Emperor simply fell on her, knocking the girl to the floor. Crushed by the man through fear, Ronaldina asked His Majesty to calm down. She said that everything was fine and nothing terrible had happened and everything would be fine. When Ronnie felt the Emperor's hand on her back, she became very scared and asked him to wait. But the man was not himself and did not hear her. He simply grabbed her into his arms. Suddenly, Ronaldina froze under His Majesty because she felt something unusual, namely that just a moment ago their lips accidentally touched. The girl blushed, realizing this, and did not move for a while. And then she tried to get out of his arms, telling him to let her go and that she needed to get up, but the Emperor had already fallen asleep. The next morning, Miss Ronaldina came to see His Majesty's doctor, who had helped him yesterday after he lost consciousness. The girl thanked Rigot with a grateful smile, and then she admitted that she came here to find out if they could find another way to cure the Emperor, because his condition was worsening. Walking down the corridor with the doctor, Ronnie said that the head of the delegation had said that they had many plants and medicinal herbs on their island that were not known on the continent. Rigot replied thoughtfully that it would be wonderful if they found medicinal herbs there. When the girl said that she could be wrong and the necessary herbs were not there, the doctor noted that then they would simply collect important information. After all, His Majesty ordered Rigot to monitor his condition, but the medicines being created contain poison that injures the body and has unpleasant side effects. Ronaldina listened attentively as the doctor said that since His Majesty's life was at stake, they must do everything to find the necessary medicines. And then the doctor suddenly asked if she had informed the delegation that they would visit them. To this, the girl answered negatively, but added that most likely they would meet the head of the delegation somewhere in the garden. And then they saw a man walking through the garden and carefully examining the herbs. Seeing him, the girl called out to the head of the delegation and ran up to him with an apology. She reminded the man that she was His Majesty's secretary, Ronaldine, and that they had met at the welcoming ceremony. With a smile, the head of the delegation replied that he remembered her and asked if she had any questions for him. At that moment, Ronnie suddenly asked him to introduce them to Poyern's expert on plants and herbs, which surprised the man. But then he smiled and said that they had come to the right place because he knew a lot about medicine and was well versed in the botanical research of scientists from Poyern. After these words, Miss Ronaldina asked to come in and sit down because their conversation could take a long time. When they came into the room and sat down, Dr. Rigot said that everything that was said now should remain between them. The doctor began to explain what their question was, but paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. When Rigot explained that his friend's problem was related to an injury, he suddenly fell silent. The head of the delegation asked why he had remained silent, to which the doctor asked him to swear him to keep the secret. Miss Ronaldina, hearing this, asked Rigot in surprise if he really wanted the man to sign a non-disclosure agreement. To this, the doctor replied that it was just for peace of mind and continued to tell that the nightmares continued and hallucinations appeared even after waking up. Sadly, Rigot added that all of this reveals a tendency toward violence, and it causes pain not only to this person, but also to those around him. The doctor added that they had been at war for 9 years to become an empire, so he thought that this injury was related to those events. But later, upon detailed analysis, it turned out that the injury had been inflicted much earlier. Rigot explained that the patient currently lives in a country house, and then he added that he could no longer contain this man and he needed to find another medicine. The head of the delegation sadly replied that there was no remedy that could eradicate a problem of this kind. Hearing these words, Miss Ronaldina looked at the man with despair. But at that moment, he added that he knew the herbs to prepare a medicine that could help. Upon hearing this, the doctor even stood up with excitement. The head of the delegation smiled and apologized for the fact that this was all he could offer them, to which Rigot excitedly replied that this would be enough to change the angle of their research. Listening to the men agree that they would need to come back for herbs tomorrow, Ronnie breathed a sigh of relief. Then the doctor, saying that he needed to return to the examination immediately, left the room with his secretary. Already walking down the corridor, Miss Ronaldina asked Rigot where the country house came from, to which he replied that his father looked after it and he was doing quite well at it. Hearing these words, the girl wondered if the doctor had really betrayed his own father for the sake of the emperor, and whether this made him a faithful servant or an immoral person. The next day, Miss Ronaldina was calmly walking through the corridors of the palace when she suddenly heard someone calling her. The girl turned around in confusion and saw the head of the delegation rushing towards her, and when the man said that he had brought the herbs he had spoken about yesterday, Ronnie smiled happily and thanked him. The man, when handing over the plant, said that it was called rendum, it was very effective, and although caustic, it was not poisonous. He explained that it should be brewed like tea. The girl, holding the plant in her hands, decided that it was very good, that it was not poisonous, and once again thanked the man. And then she added that if Sir Vahern needed anything, he would definitely let her know. Having said goodbye to the man, Ronaldina went on, thinking that if this helped His Majesty, then the head of the delegation would be her savior. Sir Vahern, smiling sweetly, waved his hand after the girl. In the evening, while combing Ronaldine's hair, her maid of honor noticed that she was drinking a new tea today, to which the girl replied that she decided to try it herself first. After this, Melvin, remembering that Ronnie had a day off tomorrow, asked if she had any plans for tomorrow, to which she received a negative answer. The maid of honor explained that she wanted to have a tea ceremony the next day and invited Miss Ronaldina to come to it. She said that some girls would just gather there to chat over dessert and asked her not to refuse. Ronnie didn't understand why Melvin wanted to see his boss on his day off, but she agreed to come, which pleased her maid of honor. But Ronaldina didn't know why she agreed, because it was a tea party that she shouldn't have gone to. When Ronnie arrived at Melvin's house by carriage, she apologized for being late, worried that everyone had already arrived. On the way to the garden, she passed columns decorated with greenery and white flowers. Melvin asked Miss Ronaldina to look at the decorations because they were considered fashionable for a reason. At that moment, the girls approached the gazebo, and Ronnie looked in surprise at the lady sitting there. She realized that she knew her, or rather saw her at the banquet, and her name was Verica Piff. After Ronnie sat down at the table, she wondered why Miss Piff had chosen to sit opposite the place of honor. And Verica silently, with only a sly smile, looked at Miss Ronaldina. Some time later, when the rest of the girls arrived and sat down at the table, on which there was tea and various delicacies, a leisurely conversation began. Miss Verica, looking at Miss Ronaldina, suddenly snorted dismissively, and then, grinning, she complained about her manners, explaining her snort by the fact that there was hair on her lips. And then she asked Ronnie if she was by any chance His Majesty's secretary. Hearing this, one of the girls in the green dress thought for a moment. And then she stood up abruptly and declared that this meant that Miss Ronaldina was a commoner. The girl in the green dress asked what trick Ronnie had used to get His Majesty to hire a commoner. She asked with malicious glee if Miss Ronaldina was listening to her. Ronnie, deciding to play for now, asked with a smile if she had said everything she wanted. Hiding her hand with a full cup of tea behind her back, the girl in the green dress angrily asked if Ronaldina had even listened to her. But then Ronnie suddenly screamed and rose abruptly from her chair. The girl in the green dress was surprised by this reaction and asked why she was screaming. And at that moment, Ronnie remembered that the villain who was constantly in the main character's way was Verica Piff. And the girl in the green dress suddenly dropped the mug she was holding and wanted to blame Ronnie for it. Looking at everything that was happening, Miss Ronaldina realized that this was absolutely not the atmosphere for enjoying tea. At this time, Verica noticed that Lady Serena had soiled her dress, and Lady Ronaldina looked shocked. So she suggested finishing the tea party and asked Lady Medela if she agreed with that, to which she received full consent. Lady Sorella looked at Lady Piff with displeasure, pointing to her dress. But she, putting her hand on the girl's shoulder, made her shut up. And then Lady Verica approached Lady Ronaldina and said that she was pleased to meet her. And then Lady Piff, bringing her face closer to Ronnie, added, so that no one could hear, that the girl's work should belong to her. Miss Ronaldina did not respond to these words. She simply ignored them. Melvin was very upset with how her tea party went. Lady Sorella, before leaving, cast a very angry glance at Ronnie. While apologizing, the girl wondered if they had really become enemies after this incident. One of the remaining girls remarked that Miss Ronaldine shouldn't worry, although at first it seemed a little intrusive. Other girls expressed hope that next time they would be able to communicate much more. Returning to the palace, Melvin, studying the papers, suddenly said that Lady Piff, it turns out, has been pursuing His Majesty for a long time. She's been trying to tease everyone ever since she was denied the job of secretary to the Emperor, but there's little they can do because the Piff family has deep pockets. In despair, the maid of honor lay down on the sofa and covered her face with her hand, because this was not at all how she had imagined tea drinking. After advising Melvin to take a rest, Miss Ronaldina decided to go for a walk. Walking along the terrace, she noticed a soldier standing guard at the entrance to the hall. The girl was glad that she didn't go for a walk in just a nightgown, but threw a large shawl over her shoulders. With a cheerful smile and a good mood, she walked along the corridors of the palace. The walk reminded Ronnie of a trip and helped clear her head. Remembering how Verica behaved, she couldn't understand who she thought she was. Suddenly, the girl noticed a small statue of a panther and stopped to examine it. As she climbed the stairs, Ronnie thought that she hadn't expected to attract the attention of the villain, and also that she was glad to take care of His Majesty. She really hoped that they would soon find a cure, and that the main character would finally appear. Then the girl saw a soldier sleeping on the top step of the stairs. Having decided to check the second floor, the girl quietly made her way past him. Quietly, she walked past him and, turning around, made sure that the soldier had not woken up. Entering the dark corridor on the second floor, Ronaldina suddenly realized that something was wrong there. She saw nothing in it and thought that it was an abandoned part of the estate. Walking in complete darkness, Miss Ronaldina suddenly saw something. Namely, how a thin strip of light was shining through the crack in the door. And when she walked through those doors, the girl realized that she shouldn't have relaxed just because she saw the light. Because inside, the first thing she saw was a broken vase lying on the floor. And also many bloodstains that were everywhere, on the floor and on His Majesty. And looking at the Emperor, who was kneeling in the middle of the hall, she realized that in this dark castle, a great, unstable, and dubious threat was hidden. The Emperor sat with his eyes open and said that he was not guilty, and also asked them not to come closer and stay away from him. Sweat was running down his face, and tears were flowing from his eyes, which had seen something of their own. He also asked his mother not to die and not to leave him. Miss Ronaldina looked at the Emperor with wide eyes. At that moment, the girl remembered herself as a child, but did not try to compare herself to him. Sitting on her knees before His Majesty, she realized that others would also feel sorry for him, because it is human nature to want to help someone who needs it. Ronaldina timidly placed her hand over the Emperor's eyes. At that moment, the girl thought that since she was here, she could help him. Holding her hand on the man's face, she felt sweat dripping down his face. Suddenly, His Majesty grabbed Ronaldina by the waist, which frightened her, and then he lowered his face towards the girl's face, making her wonder why he was so close. Ronnie felt the Emperor's heart pounding and knew she couldn't push him away. When the girl felt the man's breath on her neck, she felt a tickle. She also forgot that her nightgown was transparent, and through it the warmth of His Majesty's hands could be clearly felt. When the man hugged Ronnie tightly and buried his face in her neck, the girl called him a pervert and asked him not to touch her like that. The thought flashed through her head that he just needed to kiss her and calm down. But when the Emperor's lips began to approach hers, she became afraid. So when His Majesty covered her lips with his, she closed her eyes. At that moment, Rani could clearly smell the man's skin and was so nervous that she could hardly breathe. After the kiss, His Majesty lost consciousness and his head fell on the girl's shoulder. Looking around, Miss Ronaldina realized that she was in the Emperor's chambers. Seeing a bed nearby, the girl resolutely pulled His Majesty towards it. When Rani sat the man down on the floor next to the bed, she realized that she had wasted her time on exercises because the man was heavy. Pulling the blanket off the bed, she couldn't understand how His Majesty could fall asleep after that kiss. When the girl covered the man and was about to leave, he suddenly grabbed her hand. Rani even opened her mouth in surprise because she did not expect such actions from the sleeping emperor. Finally, thinking that she didn't understand why His Majesty was treating her this way, the girl sat down on the floor next to him. Leaning against the bed, Ronaldina sighed sadly, realizing that she wouldn't be leaving here until the morning. The girl sat and looked out the window, from which no stars were visible, and the emperor slept peacefully, his head resting on her shoulder, but she too was tired and did not notice how she fell asleep. It was early morning, and His Majesty began to wake up slowly. Opening his eyes, the man did not understand why he felt so calm, and also His Majesty did not understand why he slept sitting on the floor and assumed that he was clouded again. It was strange to him that he felt no pain and even relaxed, so he decided it was time to get to work. But then the emperor suddenly realized that he was holding Miss Ronaldine by the wrist with his other hand, and then he saw that the girl herself was sleeping, sitting next to him, with her head on his shoulder. After this, His Majesty abruptly released Ronaldina's hand from his own, not understanding why this had happened. And then the emperor realized that he simply did not let her go and hoped that he had not held her too tightly. Looking at the open doors to his chambers, the man remembered that he had ordered the guards not to let anyone in. The emperor, with a displeased look, thought that perhaps it was worth punishing them for neglecting their duties. But then he looked at the girl who was sleeping peacefully on his shoulder and changed his mind, because he realized that she had helped him again. Thinking that he didn't want Ronaldina to suffer because of him, the man picked her up in his arms. And also, when the emperor lifted the girl, he noticed that she was very light. He also suddenly realized that he was not repelled by her touch. Looking at the girl lying in his arms, the emperor realized that he had never looked at anyone so closely. From all these thoughts that visited his head, His Majesty even swallowed nervously. Sometime later, Miss Ronaldina woke up on a huge bed. Returning to her room and getting dressed, Rani went to work in the office, scolding herself for sleeping like a baby on the emperor's bed. She did not understand how she could now look into His Majesty's face, and therefore, entering the office, she quietly wished everyone good morning. Lord Venedette, who met her, said that His Majesty had warned her of her lateness. These words made the girl lower her head in embarrassment. Looking at the emperor, who was sitting at the table with his arms folded across his chest, she thought that it was all his fault. And the man with a smile asked if she had slept well and asked her not to worry. Ronaldina was surprised by the emperor's behavior and said that he was in a good mood today, to which he replied that he had simply not been so rested for a long time. Lord Venedette, hearing this, asked if the doctor had developed a new medicine, to which His Majesty replied in the negative and added that the nightmare had stopped in the middle. The man looked thoughtful and assumed that he had probably fallen asleep after that. At this time, Rani thought with hope that the emperor did not remember their kiss and suggested that maybe it was he who helped him get rid of the nightmare. And His Majesty, lost in thought, added that he had not slept long. Usil then asked the emperor if they could find out why the nightmare had ended. Drumming his long fingers on the table, His Majesty replied that it was difficult for him to answer this question. At this time, Lord Venedette, turning to Rani, said that the documents for the administrative meeting were on her desk and asked her to study them before the meeting began. Taking the documents in her hands, the girl was amazed, because on the very first sheet there was a list of potential brides. And so the meeting began. One of the advisors suddenly said sharply that His Majesty must find himself a wife. He also added that marriage is an important factor for the imperial family. Another advisor begged the emperor to at least look through the list of brides. Rani began to read out the list, starting with Lady Ludalmena, who is not only beautiful, but also smart. When the girl was reading the next Lady Shinrita, she was interrupted. The same advisor asked the emperor to look over the list, because he believed that this lady had all the qualities necessary to become empress. The next advisor began to recommend Princess Celsia Trumi of Atanan, but at that moment His Majesty suddenly said, "Enough." And Ronaldina, hearing Celsia's name, was very surprised because it was she who was the main character. When the advisors began to insist that marriage was the emperor's duty, he suddenly ordered everyone to leave quickly. UCL, seeing the emperor's gaze, stood up and shouted that everyone needed to leave immediately and that Dr. Rigot needed to be called. Someone asked if everything was all right with His Majesty, but seeing him get up, quickly began to make his way to the exit. At this point, the other advisors also realized that they had to leave and hurried out of the conference room. Miss Ronaldina, watching the men leave the room, thought that they needed to hurry. But when she stood up, she realized that she was the last one left, and the emperor was behind her. Turning around, the girl fearfully called out to His Highness, who was looking at her with a mad gaze. And then the girl realized that she had only one way out and hugged the emperor, saying that everything would be fine. Ronnie held the man tightly in her arms, praying that it would work and that His Majesty would calm down. The man's fists were clenched tightly, as if he was struggling with himself. Sweat was pouring down his face from the tension the emperor was under. But suddenly, His Majesty unexpectedly calmed down and went limp in the girl's arms. UCL, sitting on the floor and watching this scene, could not believe what had happened. Sometime later, Lord Venedet spoke with Ronaldina about how she had already managed to calm the emperor down 4 times. He didn't press her for details, but he noted that succeeding 4 times definitely meant something. And then UCL asked Miss Ronaldina to continue to take care of the emperor. The girl said that His Majesty relaxed when she hugged him and was sure that it would work next time, but Lord Venedet replied that the emperor keeps his distance from people. He then added that he was ready to raise Ronnie's salary if she continued to reassure His Majesty, but the girl replied that it was not about money at all. At that moment, she remembered how persistent the emperor had been in wanting to kiss her. And then, after the kiss, I didn't remember anything at all. UCL added that he understood that it was not at all easy to calm His Majesty, but they were now grasping at any straw. After listening to Lord Venedet, the girl asked for 1 day to think about it. When Miss Ronaldina got to her room, she took a pillow and hit it with her fist. With despair, she thought that the main character should calm the emperor down, and at this rate, he would never meet Celsia. But at the same time, the girl understood that the empire would be in danger if they did not find a way to calm him down. Out of desperation, Ronnie thought about maybe leaving Evern, but at the same time she knew that moving to another country would not be easy. Clutching her head in her hands, Ronnie realized that she had no choice but to accept UCL's offer. The next day, the emperor, sitting at the table and looking attentively at Ronaldina, asked if she had put him to bed. The girl, standing at her desk, looked at His Majesty in confusion and remained silent. She didn't know if she should tell him about it and looked nervously at Lord Venedet. Ronaldina didn't know what to answer, because His Majesty might ask how she did it, but the girl couldn't admit that she read about it in a novel. At this time, the emperor added that everything was fine, and he just wanted to know how he fell asleep. This surprised Ronaldina, and she asked if this meant that he no longer needed help, to which she received a positive answer. Thinking that this was good, the girl decided to return to work. Taking the notebook in her hands, she read through His Highness's to-do list for today. Looking at her watch, Ronnie noticed that at 15 o'clock the emperor was going to a banquet on the occasion of his birthday. So, turning to His Majesty, Ronaldina said that they needed to go to the main living room to try on the suit in 5 minutes. As the emperor stood up, the girl thought that she had become too sloppy. As she was about to leave, Ronaldina heard Lord Venedet ask if she had thought about his proposal. To this, the girl replied that she wanted to give a positive answer, but it seemed that His Majesty had other thoughts on this matter. UCL, smiling, noted that he knew that he would react this way because he wanted to do everything on his own. And then the finance minister added that they might need her help until they developed a new drug. At that moment, Dr. Rigot entered the office and asked where His Majesty was, since he had prepared another medicine for him. Hearing this, Miss Ronaldina asked the doctor about the side effects. To this, Rigot replied that he did not think they would, since he had not added any poisonous herbs, and he also hoped that it would work. The doctor asked UCL to give the medicine to the emperor and let him know if it worked. It took them 2 days to find out if the medicine worked. It was precisely after this time that His Majesty suffered another attack, and barely restraining himself, he asked for a doctor to be called. Then, Ronaldina and UCL, looking at the emperor with alarm, realized that the medicine had not worked. Lord Venedet, shouting that he would call Dr. Rigot, said that it was time for Ronnie to leave. But the girl remained standing at her table, watching as the emperor tried to cope with his madness alone. Thoughts were spinning in her head that she shouldn't help the man, because he said he didn't want it. Miss Ronaldina lowered her head and understood that the medicine had not helped His Majesty, and that he was in a very difficult situation now. At this time, the emperor asked the girl to hurry and leave as quickly as possible. And a moment later, His Majesty shouted to Ronaldine that it was time for her to run, because it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to restrain himself. But opening his eyes, the man was surprised to notice Ronnie, who leaned over the table and extended her hand towards him. In desperation, His Majesty shouted at the girl to get away, as he did not want to hurt her. But she did not listen to him and walked around the table with sharp steps. And then, looming over the emperor, Miss Ronaldina shouted that he could not cope on his own because his body had become resistant to the medicine. Holding His Majesty by the shoulders, Ronnie spoke with feeling about how he knew she could help him. The girl did not understand how he could reject her sincere help. With tears in her eyes, Ronnie asked if the emperor was an idiot. The girl did not understand why the man was so stubborn, and then, deciding that she was doing this for both of them, she hugged him sharply. The only thing she didn't know was whether she should kiss the emperor again before he fell into a stupor. Closing her eyes, Ronaldina understood that this was not what she wanted, but if it was necessary, she was ready. But then, suddenly, the girl realized that she had actually called the emperor an idiot, and now she didn't know whether she should ask him for forgiveness. When Ronnie decided to say that she had lost her head for a moment, the emperor suddenly said that he now knew how she perceived him. Hearing this, the girl replied that she just wanted to say that they were all worried about him. And frightened, she added that she had not meant what she said at all. Moving away from His Majesty and bowing her head, Ronnie apologized for her rudeness and added that she would leave now. Turning around and already heading towards the exit of the office, the girl suddenly realized that she had forgotten something. Specifically, she forgot to give the emperor the medicinal tea that the head of the delegation from Poyern had given her. So, turning around, Ronaldina handed him the tea, explaining that it contained an extract and helped with headaches. Lowering her head, the girl added that the doctor had checked the ingredients and the tea should be effective. After this, the girl, with the emperor's permission, turned around and left the office. His Majesty was sitting in the study, looking at the tea, when Uciel returned, and then he asked him again to call Dr. Rigot. Sometime later, Lord Venedet made tea and brought a cup of it to His Majesty. When Uciel said he was glad the tea was helping ease the emperor's symptoms, he asked if Ronnie had asked the delegation about it. To this, Lord Venedet replied that the girl had made an offer to the doctor, and although the new medicine had not helped, the tea seemed to be effective. The emperor regretted that they couldn't tell Ronaldina about this because today was her day off. And when he added that Uciel should inform the delegation that they wanted to buy it wholesale, he said with a smile that he had already done so. Hearing these words, the emperor only looked attentively at the Minister of Finance and remained silent. At this time, he remembered how Ronnie gave him the tea, saying that it should be effective. And he also didn't understand why her mood changed so quickly, because at one moment she was trembling with fear, and at another, full of determination. Propping his chin on his hand, His Majesty wondered if she was really next to him. The man remembered how he once found her sleeping next to him, and also the way she angrily asked him how he was going to cope with his attacks alone. The emperor was still unsure whether she was looking after him or scolding him, and yet he still didn't understand how Ronaldine managed to put him to sleep. Unexpectedly, the emperor turned to Uciel and asked if he considered him an idiot. With a smile, the man replied that this was true, although few understood it, but it was true, and he also became interested in who could say this to His Majesty. At this time, Miss Ronaldina was present at another tea party. She asked the girl sitting opposite her in surprise what her boyfriend had told her. And she, rising from her chair, told how the man, lowering his eyes, admitted that he was blinded by her beauty. The invitation to this tea party came after Melvin's tea party and was much smaller. Several ladies with whom Ronaldina had become friends were present, and on it, the girls discussed a man who confessed his love to one of them, and they started dating. There were only 5 of them, but with delicious tea and cakes, they always managed to have a good time. Ronaldina, besides Melvin, considered one more girl a friend, and that was Illy Roatmill, who was hosting tea today. It was she who asked Ronnie if she was dating anyone, because it was impossible for gentlemen to leave such a beauty alone. To this, Ronaldina, smiling, replied that she was too busy to meet anyone. She was just happy to be alive. One of the girls noticed that to become His Majesty's secretary, Rani beat out all her competitors. Illy asked how Rani was working with the Emperor, and the girls added with a smile that Miss Roatmill was in love with him. Watching the girl explain that His Majesty was perfect, Ronaldina realized that she had deep feelings for him. And also, Illy always talked about the Emperor at all meetings. And although Ronaldina smiled, in her heart she felt sorry for the girl, because he was destined to be with Celcia. Meanwhile, Lord Venedette was telling His Majesty that, thanks to Rani, he was showing signs of recovery, so he decided to conduct an experiment. When Uciel added that he would first try to hold the Emperor by his arms and legs when he lost consciousness, the gloomy man asked if he considered him his Emperor. But Lord Venedette did not listen to him. He decided to try something now and extended his hand to the hands of His Majesty. But the Emperor did not allow himself to be touched and asked what he was doing, while Lord Venedette, not paying attention to Duran, concluded that he was still uncomfortable with human touches. With a smile spreading his arms to the sides, Uciel decided to hug the Emperor. Seeing this, Duran shouted at him not to dare come near him. But Uciel still hugged the man, and, despite the gloomy Emperor, wrote in his notebook that he didn't like hugs either. When His Majesty heard that Lord Venedette would invite assistance starting tomorrow, he decided that he definitely did not consider him his Emperor. And Ronaldina, at this time, although she was having a good time, for some reason wondered if everything was all right in the palace. From behind the luxurious doors, one can hear a girl being stopped and asked to discuss the matter elsewhere. She turns around excitedly, her face lighting up with a smile when she spots the Emperor. Entering the office, the girl introduces herself, saying that her name is Illy Roatmill, feeling the gaze of those present on her. With an enthusiastic smile, she says that it is a great honor for her to see His Majesty so close, and that before, she admired him from afar. Miss Ronaldina, taking the girl by the shoulder, asked her to go with her outside. But she couldn't move Illy from her place and realized that she was very strong. Miss Roatmill, ignoring Rani, extended her hand towards the Emperor, on which lay a small gift. At that moment, the guards crossed their swords in front of the girl, not letting her go ahead, saying that in order to visit His Majesty, she needed to obtain permission. And then the guards, grabbing Miss Roatmill by the arm, began to lead her out of the office, but she began to break free and scream to be let go, because Rani had allowed her to come. Miss Ronaldino looked at Illy in bewilderment, not understanding when she had told her such a thing. But the girl continued to claim that Rani had promised to arrange a meeting for her with the Emperor. Ronaldina, to all these words, confidently replied that she had never said such a thing. But Illy, with tears in her eyes, accused the girl of deceiving her. Miss Roatmill, crying, told how Rani offered to arrange a meeting for her with His Majesty because she noticed how she admired him from afar. Lord Venedette looked at the crying girl with bewilderment. And then, approaching Miss Ronaldine, he asked what was going on here, but she, clutching her head, did not understand what was happening. Illy, at this time, accused Rani of promising to arrange a meeting with the Emperor for a certain fee, and she sent her gifts. Then the girl seemed to accidentally drop the gift that was intended for His Majesty, and then she stepped on him with her shoe, so hard that she crushed him. Pointing her finger at Ronaldina, Illy confidently stated that she had sent her many gifts, including an expensive necklace. Falling to her knees and pointing her finger at Rani, the girl confidently shouted that she had taken a bribe. Uciel, hearing this, quietly asked the girl if it was true, to which she was surprised. Did he really believe Illy? But the man replied that she spoke about it so confidently that he had to ask. Miss Roatmill, looking at the Emperor at this time, asked him to believe her. She added that Rani offered to arrange a meeting with her, and she simply showed up as she was told. Miss Ronaldina looked thoughtfully at the one she considered a friend and thought that these words sounded very convincing, and she also assumed that something was wrong with Ilya. Miss Roatmill at that moment said that Rani had specially approached her at the tea party, and then she assumed that she had made friends with her on purpose so that she would lower her guard. And tears began to flow from the girl's eyes, and she said that most likely both reasons were involved. After this, Illy shouted angrily that Ronaldina did not deserve to be the Emperor's secretary. Hearing these words, Rani, unexpectedly for everyone, laughed. Miss Roatmill, seeing this, even stopped crying out of surprise, and then asked if the girl had gone crazy. To this, having calmed down, Miss Ronaldina replied that she had returned all the gifts that she had sent. But Illy angrily exclaimed that this was a lie and none of the gifts were returned to her. She added that the palace has all the records of all gifts delivered and returned. With a crazy smile, Miss Roatmill said that all the evidence was there, and then Illy, bowing her head before the Emperor, added that she was very sorry that his secretary turned out to be a villain and that he should take action. At this time, documents about the gifts were brought and UCL carefully looked through them. But Miss Roatmill did not calm down. She insisted that Ronnie should be punished. And then, unexpectedly, she heard Lord Venedette say that, judging by the records, Ronaldina had indeed sent several items recently. UCL explained that once a month they return the things that were delivered to the palace, and Ronnie sent several things 3 days ago. And then he added that no one could have forged the records, since they were sent to him immediately, at which point Miss Ronaldina added that she sent all the things in the original packaging. Tears began to flow from Illy's eyes. She lowered her head in despair and whispered that she knew for sure that nothing had returned to the estate. And Ronnie explained that when Miss Roatmill asked how long it took to deliver things from the yard, she sensed that something was wrong and said 2 days, although in fact they were delivered in a week, so all the gifts were still on the way. Hearing these words, the girl bowed her head even lower, because she could not believe it. Suddenly, the Emperor, who was watching all this, asked if they were finished, and then added that they should bring Miss Roatmill to justice. The girl, hearing these words, prostrated herself on the floor and began to beg His Majesty to have mercy on her, because she simply wanted to be in his presence. When the guards lifted Illy from the floor, she began to make excuses in confusion, saying that it was not her fault. The Emperor, however, was surprised and asked if she really thought he was a fool, and angrily asked how she dared to try to start a conversation with him. His Majesty paid no more attention to the girl and asked UCL to review one of the documents, which made Miss Roatmill look at him with distrust. The guards also didn't wait long and led the girl out of the office, closing the doors tightly behind them. That evening, when Ronnie came to her room, Melvin greeted her with the words that she knew what had happened today, and the whole palace was buzzing with the news. When Ronaldina asked if everyone knew what had happened, the maid of honor added that everyone knew that Miss Roatmill had tried to make her out to be a thief. Hearing these words, the girl laughed and then said that she was not a thief, and she thought that if she hadn't taken action, she would have been fired and sent to prison. Melvin remembered how Ronnie thought Illy had ulterior motives, and her intuition had never been wrong. As the maid of honor was about to leave the room, Miss Ronaldina called her by name. Approaching Melvin, she gave her the gift and, apologizing, said that she could not accept it, and then asked that it be sent along with the rest. Having placed the candle on the table by the bed, the maid of honor wished Ronnie good night and left her room. Ronaldina, sitting on the bed, did not understand why Illy did this, because she was a noble woman, and she wondered if she really hated her that much. Already going to bed, the girl decided that she had to be careful, because if she hadn't listened to UCL, she would have been dragged through the courts. Already falling asleep, Ronnie was still trying to understand why Miss Roatmill needed to set her up. And the girl also hoped that no one pushed Illy to take this step and that she planned everything herself. A new day had dawned. The bright sun illuminated the park and the gazebo standing in it. Ronnie, sitting at her desk, felt very calm. Suddenly, Lord Venedette approached the girl's table and looked at her. When Ronaldina looked at him questioningly, the man told her that Miss Roatmill was in prison, awaiting trial. Hearing these words, the girl asked UCL if he knew what would happen to her. To this, the man answered negatively with a smile, since only the court will issue a verdict as soon as it makes a decision. He also said that her parents asked for an audience and begged the Emperor for forgiveness, but he, although he does not say this, values Ronnie highly, so it was useless. Walking down the corridor, Ronnie suddenly asked how often this happened, to which UCL replied that bribery was everywhere she went. The maids they passed suddenly bowed their heads, surprising the girl. As she passed them, Ronnie suggested that perhaps Miss Roatmill thought she could get away with it because she was His Majesty's secretary, a commoner. UCL responded to this that everything was possible and praised Ronaldina for doing everything right. Suddenly they saw a man running straight towards them who did not see them. The girl, helping Lord Venedette to get up after he was knocked down by the man, asked if he was okay. When UCL wanted to answer that something was wrong, Ronaldina suddenly recognized the man who had demolished them and was very surprised by this. After all, it was Lord Claret, who, sitting on the floor, asked them for help, because the delegation from Austin arrived a month ahead of schedule. Hearing these words, Miss Ronaldina rushed down the corridor, clicking her heels. They burst into the Emperor's office. The girl, having caught her breath, called out to His Majesty. At this time, Darren was sitting at his desk, sorting through papers. When His Majesty looked at Ronnie, she exclaimed that the delegation from Austin had arrived. Hearing this, the Emperor was surprised and asked if they weren't supposed to arrive in a month. Ronaldina agreed with him and added that they hadn't had time to prepare for their visit. Darren winced at this unexpected news, and the girl added that Lords Clarat and Vedene had gone to meet them. The Emperor then looked at the maid who was standing near the table, and she quickly went to get his official suit. Realizing this, Miss Ronaldina told His Majesty that she would wait for him at the door of the office. After this, the girl left the office and stood at the door, leaning against the wall. She understood that everything that was happening was very hectic, but at the same time, Ronnie couldn't stop thinking about the way the Emperor looked at her. Grabbing her head, the girl resolutely ordered herself to pull herself together. Then she saw that the door to the office opened and the Emperor came out, surprising her by getting ready so quickly. Miss Ronaldina looked at the magnificent-looking Darren. His Majesty, looking at the girl, asked where Lords Venedette and Claret were waiting with the delegation. After this, the man walked down the corridor with a decisive step, and behind him followed the girl. At this time, Ronaldina was thinking that the two main characters had finally met and that the story would really begin to develop. The girl understood that the story had deviated significantly from the original plot and hoped that everything would return to normal. Opening the door to the hall, Ronaldina decided that if their relationship did not develop, then she would have to push them a little. The girl didn't remember the details, but she believed that the sooner their relationship began, the easier it would be for her. When the Emperor entered the hall, Yusiel said with relief that His Majesty had arrived. Daron, turning to the princess, noted that they had come a long way. To this, the girl, introducing herself as Celsia Trowie, replied that this was not so, and it was all thanks to the fact that he had sent the carriage and the knights. Looking at the princess and the Emperor, the girl thought that they had started well, and then they started discussing possible trade between the two countries, and Celsia asked if they were going to use the Trigovan route permanently, to which she received a positive answer. At this moment, the atmosphere in the hall became so dense that the tension could be cut with a knife. And all because they couldn't agree on the price for the Trigovan route. The princess believed that this path would become more valuable over time, and therefore she was not sure that the price they had agreed upon now would be fair in the future. She added that the Trigovan route has its advantages, but His Majesty believed that they were overestimating his value, because Evern could always find a new passage if he made the effort. The princess replied with a smile that Evern was surrounded by the highest and most powerful mountains, and she was curious how they would make a passage through them. When the Emperor replied that it might be difficult for her kingdom, but not for the Empire, the faces of his subjects fell, for he had just mocked Austin in the presence of their princess. To this, Celsia replied that he could no longer rule with an iron fist, because they lived in an era when countries were establishing trade for maximum benefit. At this time, Ronaldina thought that she did not understand His Majesty and was sure that the lords sitting nearby were also at a loss for words. Here the girl realized that the princess was not at all afraid of His Majesty. At that time, Celsia noted that she knew that the negotiations would not go smoothly and that this was a big request on their part. At this point, Miss Ronaldina looked at the Emperor and, seeing his gaze, realized that many people would have run away screaming if they had met the Emperor's gaze, but not Celsia. His Majesty decided to end the negotiations for today and suggested continuing them later, to which the princess agreed and added that then they would definitely come to some kind of decision. After this, the Emperor closed his eyes, and Ronnie, looking at him, decided that he was not one of those who fall in love at first sight. At this time, Lord Claret, getting up from the sofa, offered to escort the princess to her chambers. Celsia, having adjusted her hair and smiling at the Emperor, said goodbye to him. The next day, Ronnie was sitting in her office and decided to call Lord Venedette. But then she realized that she had forgotten that Yusiel was busy at the upcoming birthday banquet. She remembered that His Majesty was not interested in celebrating his birthday, and she did not want to organize a banquet. At that moment, the girl heard a servant report that Princess Celsia had come to see His Majesty. The girl entered the office and thanked the Emperor for agreeing to receive her. Turning to Ronaldina, the princess looked at her with a sly smile. Seeing this look, Ronnie stood up and, turning to His Majesty, said that she needed to check something about the banquet, and she would return soon. With a commanding sigh, His Majesty released the girl and asked the princess to continue. Miss Ronaldino, taking the papers from the table, walked past Celsia towards the exit. As she was already closing the doors, the girl saw the emperor heading towards the princess and thought that she was glad that he had agreed to the meeting. Ronnie, remembering the plot, thought that everything was fine between them from the very beginning, but she was wrong. Only after UCL scolded the emperor, he did everything possible to treat Celsia with respect. But the princess's visits became more frequent, and at meetings she tried to continue the first conversation. She believed that the treaty they had previously concluded was unfair to her country and tried to change the details in it. Finally, His Majesty, angry, told the princess that he wanted her to visit him only once a week, at an appointed time and day. When Celsia tried to object, the emperor threatened to stop negotiations altogether. So today, watching the emperor sit down opposite the princess, Ronnie was happy. Looking at the closed doors, Miss Ronaldina decided that Celsia was definitely interested in His Majesty. Holding the handle of the office door, Ronnie decided to leave them alone as much as possible. The girl heard nothing of what was happening behind closed doors. And then, suddenly realizing that she had almost opened the door back, she turned her hand away. Closing her eyes, the girl understood that if she went back in, she would be in their way. So, pulling herself together and knowing that this was important, Ronaldina walked with a determined step down the corridor. Seeing Lord Venedette standing at one of the doors and reading papers, the girl called out to him. He was very surprised to see Ronnie and asked what she was doing there. Miss Ronaldina looked at the man with embarrassment, not knowing what reason to give for her presence. But suddenly UCL asked if Princess Trumi had really come to see the Emperor. The girl realized that Lord Venedette knew that she had come up with a reason to leave His Majesty alone with Celsia. Ronnie hoped that he wouldn't ask her why she did that, and at that time, UCL suggested that she look around since she came. When the girl asked if she would disturb him, Lord Venedette replied with a smile that she had already arrived. At that moment, Miss Ronaldina realized that sometimes UCL got on her nerves. Following the man, the girl tried to persuade herself to show restraint and not hit him. So, noticing that the banquet was just around the corner, Ronnie asked how things were going, to which UCL replied that not everything was perfect, but everything was going as planned. When he added that this would be the first official banquet in honor of Duran's birthday since he became emperor, the girl looked at him in surprise. And Lord Venedette said that this is precisely why he collaborates with other officials to make it special. Noticing that the girl didn't know that His Majesty wasn't interested in his birthday, UCL explained that it wasn't a priority for him and that it was only thanks to her that they would finally be able to throw a lavish party. Ronaldina, embarrassed by these words, explained that she had simply told the Emperor that banquets also contributed to the growth of the empire. UCL, deciding to change the subject, suddenly asked the girl if His Majesty had taken his medicine today. Ronaldina answered this question positively and added that he also drank some renpum tea. The girl was very interested in whether Celsia would intercede if His Majesty lost consciousness. In the novel, Ronnie read that they hug and their relationship will move to another level. But for some reason, these thoughts did not add much joy to the girl. Even UCL stopped and asked if Ronnie was okay, as she looked a bit pale. Smiling and waving at the man, the girl replied that everything was fine. Returning to the office and sitting at her desk, Ronaldina realized that she was not at all okay. Looking at the Emperor, she hoped that it was just mood swings. At that moment, she saw that His Majesty was looking at her and wondered why he was looking like that. And then, assuming that the Emperor most likely noticed that she felt constrained next to him, she decided that anyway he shouldn't look at her like that. Ronaldina stood up resolutely from the table, apologized, and turned to His Majesty. Looking at the Emperor, she asked if he wanted anything from her. Hearing these words, His Majesty stood up and walked towards Ronnie. Then, approaching the table, the man stood opposite the girl and looked at her. His hand fell sharply on her desk, as if he was trying to hold on. Seeing that His Majesty was swaying and clutching his head, Ronnie ran out from behind the table, asking if she could help with anything. But the Emperor answered negatively and asked Ronaldina to leave because he did not want to hurt her. When he added that the girl should leave quickly, he heard her say that everything was fine. Then Ronaldina hugged the man and thought that she didn't know why, but she wasn't afraid of him anymore. The girl wanted to be useful, at least for a moment, because soon the main character would replace her. But until then, she could not leave the Emperor alone. Stroking the man's cheek, Ronaldina wondered if it was because she got to know him better or because she felt compassion for the man in front of her. The girl felt sorry that she could only ease the pain temporarily. After kissing the man, Ronaldina realized that the only problem was that she began to feel a little awkward when it happened. By moving away from the Emperor, she hoped that she had managed to calm him down. Ronnie lowered her head and thought that everything had gone well, and was sure that His Majesty had already passed out and needed to be moved to a safe place. But suddenly the girl heard the Emperor's voice, who asked if she had calmed him down again. The girl was shocked and wondered if His Majesty had woken up during the kiss and remembered everything, and that was not good. Suddenly Ronaldina felt the Emperor's hand take hers in his, and then the Emperor, looking at the girl with gratitude, sincerely thanked her. At that moment she realized that she wanted to get out of here. On the high ceiling, a magnificent chandelier sparkled with lights. Many of the guests paid attention to it and asked others to look at it, saying that it was not created by a real master. The guests were pleased that today's banquet was similar to a birthday banquet. Miss Ronaldina stood in a beautiful blue dress and looked at the guests. The girl heard Lord Claret telling his assistants that there would be a lot of work during the celebration. The young aristocrats noted that all the guests looked excited, and then they saw the head of the delegation from Poyern and realized that there were a lot of new faces this year. Miss Ronaldina at that moment was thinking that His Majesty would appear here any minute. The girl still couldn't get the moment out of her head when the Emperor thanked her after she helped him. Looking at her reflection on the floor, Ronnie thought that perhaps His Majesty didn't care, but it wasn't easy for her to be around him. When Ronaldina was thinking about how awkward she still felt, she saw a shoe that had stepped on her reflection. Raising her head, the girl noticed Verica, who stood opposite her and, fanning herself, asked if she saw the Imperial Secretary in front of her. Then Miss Piff added that no matter how smartly Ronaldine dressed, she would always be a commoner. The girl looked at Verica with bewilderment in her eyes, not understanding what she was talking about. And then she replied that there were rumors that Miss Piff always showed up when the Emperor was arranging something, and she regretted that she had not gotten a job as a secretary and could not always be with him. These words angered Verica because Ronnie hit a sore spot. So Miss Piff responded by saying that if everything had gone according to plan, Ronnie would be in jail instead of chatting here. After these words, Miss Ronaldina understood Verica's entire insidious plan. The girl remembered her first tea party, where she was introduced to Miss Rotemile. And also, after meeting her, Illy confidently went to greet another girl. It was Venica, and Miss Rotemile stood with her for quite a long time, so now Ronnie realized that it all started right then. So Miss Ronaldina confidently asked Miss Piff if she had been egging Illy on. Hearing this, Venica asked again what she meant by saying she was egging her on. And then she added with a smile that she had no idea what Ronnie was talking about, because she had simply given Miss Rotemile a few pieces of advice, since they both had the deepest respect for the Emperor. Then Miss Piff, remembering Illy behind bars, added that as far as she knew, she said that the butler had helped her, and with a cheeky grin she explained that this meant that Ronnie wouldn't be able to drag her into this. And when the girl looked at Verica, she added that she was sorry that everything was not as she imagined. Noticing this look, Miss Piff asked why Ronaldina was looking at her like that. The girl who was standing nearby, hearing this question, asked Verica if something had happened. Ronaldina, sighing heavily, noticed that they were all very strange. And the girl also found one thing very interesting. Namely, that noble ladies like them perceive her, a commoner, as a threat, because in their place, she would not have drawn attention to herself. Looking at all these ladies' faces, full of anger, Ronnie realized that she was a bigger threat than she thought. So the girl replied that she did not intend to be involved in high society for long. To this, Miss Piff replied with an evil grin that Ronnie was a simple commoner, and no one would consider her as the Emperor's wife. And when Ronaldina turned away and was about to leave her, Venica added that the girl could wear as many beautiful dresses as she wanted, but His Majesty would not pay attention to her. At this time, the steward announced the arrival of the Emperor, and everyone began to praise His Majesty, the Panther of the Empire. Watching the man enter the hall, Miss Ronaldina thought of something but did not say it out loud. Namely, that she never wanted something like this, because she already knew who the Emperor would marry. At that moment, Ronnie noticed the Emperor's gaze, which stopped on her. And standing surrounded by ladies, the girl, with her head down, thought that she had nothing to do with it. As usual at such events, the Emperor climbed the steps and sat on his throne. Aristocrats began to approach him with greetings and congratulations. And those who had not yet arrived were waiting their turn, talking about something. Miss Ronaldina realized that now that His Majesty was here, she had to stand next to him, but she didn't want to. Thinking that she should forget everything and deal with the consequences later, the girl suddenly felt a touch on her hand. Looking up, Ronaldina saw the Duke asking how she was doing. The girl was delighted because she had not expected to see him today, and asked how things were in the duchy and whether Zira was coping with work. His lordship asked to hold their horses, explaining that he would answer all questions in order. The man said that his trading company was doing very well. Upon hearing this, Ronnie replied that she was glad that he was able to establish connections with the Madigan Guild, and that it would definitely benefit his business. The Duke, suddenly looking at the girl, said that he was happy that she had become the Emperor's secretary and asked her to take care of him, because despite the fact that he had gone through a lot in his youth, he had made Evern an empire. When Ronaldina asked what his lordship meant, Uciel approached them and, turning to the man, said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Smiling and greeting Lord Venedette, the Duke replied that he had grown from a sweet boy into a handsome young man, to which he was embarrassed, but said that he was pleased to hear this and asked permission to take Ronaldine away. Waving them goodbye, his lordship hoped that he and Ronnie would see each other again. Walking with Uciel, the girl asked if he had come for her because she was idle, but he apologized and replied that His Majesty was urgently calling her. Hearing these words, Ronaldina told the man that he did not need to apologize for this. Suddenly, she saw the heads of delegations, Poyern and Austin, who had also been invited, and wondered why they were standing together. Approaching the Emperor, the girl asked if he was okay, to which he replied that he had a severe headache. Hearing this, Uciel said that he would go and ask the servants to bring tea. As Ronnie silently begged Lord Venedette not to leave her here alone, she heard His Majesty say that she should work, not gossip. To this, the girl, with surprise, answered him that Lord Venedette was with him. Here His Majesty grabbed his head, and Ronnie asked if his head hurt badly, to which the Emperor replied that it had gotten worse from the noise. Then the girl offered him to hold her hand. His Majesty remarked that if they held hands, the whole society would be shocked, and no matter how they played, tongues would wag. And then, looking at the girl, he added that she should take care of herself, because she was his only secretary. A table with various desserts was rolled up to the Emperor, and a servant poured wine into glasses. Lord Venedette, who had returned, asked His Majesty with a smile whether he would order the food and wine to be taken away. Ronnie, who had been watching the conversation, wondered if they were going to throw it away, as it was very wasteful. The Emperor at this time looked attentively at Miss Ronaldina, and then he ordered dessert to be brought, and upon hearing this, the girl thought that he was going to drink it with tea. Smiling, Ronnie mentally decided that His Majesty and this sweet dessert were so contradictory, and the Emperor, looking at the girl, suddenly asked if she would like to try dessert. Looking at the Emperor in surprise, Ronnie apologized and replied that everything was fine. The girl did not understand what had happened to the Emperor because he was behaving so strangely. After all, His Majesty almost never turns to her, and she suggested that maybe he felt better after tea with Renpoom. At this time, Uciel asked Ronnie why she didn't try it, to which the girl replied that she simply didn't like desserts. When Lord Venedette, saying that they were very tasty, helped himself to more, the Emperor asked if he wasn't tired of sweets, since he was struggling to lose weight, to which Uciel remarked that he only allowed himself sweets at banquets. With a smile, the man added that he did not remember at all what His Majesty had said. The Emperor, hearing these words, asked Lord Venedette in surprise if he was joking. And then, looking at the table, he asked in surprise where all the cake had gone. Ronnie watched the squabble between the Emperor and the Minister of Finance with a smile. Turning away, the girl tried to contain the laughter that was trying to escape from her. His Majesty, looking at Miss Ronaldina, suddenly said that he wanted her to eat the desserts, not Uciel. Hearing this, the girl could not restrain herself and quietly, covering her mouth with her hand, laughed. At that moment, Celsia approached the throne and greeted the venerable panther Evern. She added that she wanted to congratulate His Majesty on his birthday. Smiling, Celsia said she was honored to be here today and asked if he had made a decision yet. The ladies, seeing the girl near the throne, began to wonder with surprise who she was and whether they really had anything to discuss with the Emperor. Ronaldina, at that moment, was thinking that she knew that everything had to go to the next level, but she didn't expect the princess to take the initiative. And yet, the girl did not understand why this made her feel so sick, and it was difficult to follow their conversation. Suddenly, the Emperor noticed that something was wrong with Ronaldina and called her by name. And when Yusiel asked if everything was okay with her, the girl apologized and replied that she was not feeling well. Roni, having warned that she would go out into the fresh air, went out onto the loggia. The girl didn't understand what was wrong, and the bra wasn't too dark since Melvin had taken her measurements. She still couldn't understand why she felt unwell. And also, Ronaldina understood that from this moment, everything would change. She became interested in when they would begin to treat His Majesty, and also, she never thought that sitting and waiting would be very difficult. Here, Rani assumed that she felt bad because, worried about the future, in desperation she mentally screamed for Celsia to cure him, and they could get married. And then the girl tried to pull herself together because she had to return to work. Entering the hall, Rani walked through the crowd of guests to the throne. But there was no one there, and the girl wondered with surprise where everyone had gone. Looking around, Rani wondered if she should wait for them to return. And then she saw the Emperor's servant running from the room they did not use during banquets. As she followed him, Rani wondered if something had happened while she was gone. As she approached the room, she saw Celsia standing in the doorway. Rani came closer and looked at the princess's face and saw that she was very scared. When Miss Ronaldina wanted to ask what Celsia was doing there, she suddenly saw the Emperor. He was lying on the floor, and next to him sat Yusiel, not knowing how to help. The girl, seeing this, rushed towards them with alarm. Looking at Lord Venedette, Rani asked how long ago this happened. The man explained that His Majesty took medicine in the morning, and now the servant ran for the doctor. Ronaldina watched as Yusiel tried to hold the Emperor's hand so he couldn't hurt himself. Looking back at the princess, the girl thought that everything was happening too quickly, and Celsia had not come to his aid. So Rani told the princess that she would explain everything to her later, and hoped that she would keep everything a secret. Approaching Celsia, the girl added that this was necessary to maintain diplomatic relations. Looking back at the Emperor, Rani closed the door to the room tightly. Kneeling before His Majesty, she asked Lord Venedette to wait a little longer. And then, turning to His Majesty, she asked him to concentrate. Already together, they tried to stop the hand of the Emperor, who was trying to strangle himself. Tears were streaming from his eyes, and Rani, seeing this, asked the man not to blame himself. The girl thought with horror about what he had gone through in childhood, that it was affecting him so much now. Leaning closer to his face, Rani realized that this was painful not only for him, but for those around him as well. Having kissed the Emperor, the girl realized that things would only get worse for her. Lord Venedette looked at Ronaldina's actions with surprise but said nothing. After some time, Yusiel, understanding what the girl was going through, called her by name. She, looking closely at the Emperor, asked if everything was all right. To this, Yusiel replied that His Majesty had fallen asleep and asked the girl to stop crying. And then, he added thoughtfully, that things were not going well and the secret had become clear, and he still did not know how to explain to Princess Trumi what she had seen. Rani, thinking that the Celsia she knew would not blackmail with what she saw, but she needed to make sure of it, so she asked Lord Venedette to allow her to speak with Her Highness herself. Ronaldina, recalling the novella, realized that she did not remember all the details. She remembered only individual moments from different parts of the book, but she remembered the key turns in it. But the way the plot deviated from the original made the girl uneasy. After all, she understood that if things continued like this, she would not be the only one who would continue to suffer. Remembering His Majesty, she realized that he would also feel very bad. After some time, Rani stood in the corridor in front of the office, gathering her courage. Then she opened the door and saw His Highness, Princess Trumi. Entering, she thanked her for agreeing to come, and Celsia, smiling in response, said that she also had questions for her and thanked her for the invitation. When the servant poured the tea, the girl introduced herself again, saying that she was Ronaldina, His Majesty's secretary. At this time, the servant asked if Rani needed anything else. Having replied that nothing was needed, the girl allowed him to leave. When the servant had left, Celsia asked Miss Ronaldina if His Majesty was suffering from any illness. To this, Rani asked if she had witnessed this, to which the princess replied that she had been there from the moment the Emperor became ill until the moment the secretary closed the door in front of her. Looking at Celsia, who was drinking tea, Ronaldina decided that if she continued to beat around the bush, she would never reveal her true intentions. The girl could have predicted what Celsia's reaction would be, but she wanted her to feel sorry for His Majesty and rush to his aid next time, so she replied that the Emperor had PTSR. Rani added that the princess caught him at an inopportune moment. She remembered Uciel asking if Celsia would understand them, to which Rani had then replied that they had no other choice. And then, adding that if everything was explained properly, she asked to leave everything to her. At this point, the princess inquired what kind of injury the emperor was suffering from, and then she added that there was no need to answer this question because she had not imagined it, and it must have been difficult for His Majesty to talk to her. At this point, Ronaldina hadn't even begun to explain, but the princess had already drawn conclusions. Standing up, Celsia added that she would not blab about it and that they had no need to worry. Then the princess suddenly approached Rani, which surprised her greatly, and Celsia, having looked carefully at the dress, removed the hair from it. Smiling and apologizing, the princess explained that she simply could not stand such things. When a surprised Ronaldina thanked Celsia, she replied that she would talk to His Majesty when he felt better, and said that she had to go. Looking after the princess, Rani wondered if everything would be okay, because she hadn't even explained anything to her. She didn't understand whether she should resort to extreme measures to bring them together. After thinking for a bit while riding in the carriage, the girl realized that she shouldn't overdo it. Then she entered the hall, where there were again many guests. Rani sighed heavily and thought that she had so many worries, and she also needed to report to Uciel. Walking through the guests, the girl thought that the banquet was already on its second day, and the hall was also overcrowded. Seeing His Majesty sitting on the throne, Rani thought that he must have gotten better. As she passed the column, the girl realized that she needed to be near him. But at that moment she was called out to, and looking back, Rani saw her friends. They asked if Ronaldina was busy, to which she replied that she had some time. And then the girls suddenly grabbed Rani's hands in theirs, which surprised her greatly. And then, with concern, they asked if she was okay and if Illy had done her any harm. The girls couldn't understand how Miss Rotemile could do such a thing after the time they had spent with her, and assumed she had ulterior motives from the start. And when one of the girls said that she heard that Lady Piff was behind all this, she greatly surprised Ronaldina. The girl explained that this was not the first time Verica had used others for her own purposes, and suggested that she most likely had something against her and Illy, and was trying to get rid of both of them. They added that if the rumors are true, then Lady Piff will not stop and Ronaldine needs to be more careful. Then the girls smiled and calmed down, because they had warned Ronnie, and Ronaldina, having thought about it, realized that her friends were almost right. Remembering Verica, the girl suggested that Celsia might soon be in danger. Ronnie grabbed her head in alarm, not knowing what to do. One of the girls asked if she was sick. Smiling, Ronaldina answered negatively and said that she was simply swamped with work. The girls, saying that they would meet another time, left, and Ronnie waved after them. She tried to remember when Venica started acting against Celsia in the novel. Ronaldina remembered that she almost died during the hunting festival, but she didn't remember how it happened. The girl realized that she needed to remember better, because there was something else at that tea party. Miss Ronaldina was so lost in thought that she didn't look where she was going, and as a result, she collided with someone and almost fell. But strong hands did not allow the girl to fall and supported her. It was Lord Waidenet who said that she should thank His Majesty, since it was he who asked for help. At this moment, the Emperor, folding his arms across his chest, asked where his tea was. Uciel apologized with a smile and admitted that he had forgotten about the tea and would now ask the servant to bring it. And the Emperor, turning to Rani, asked what she was thinking and said that she should be more attentive. The girl, having thanked the man, said that there was nothing wrong and thanked the Emperor, to which he remarked that she should definitely be grateful. Rani did not understand what had just happened and promised His Majesty to be careful in the future. And then she said that the princess had promised to keep everything she had seen a secret, to which the Emperor remarked that this would lift the burden from Uciel's shoulders. Rani added with a smile that Lord Venedet would definitely feel relieved, and then she noticed that the Emperor looked at her strangely, and he, without stopping looking at the girl, suddenly asked if she was worried about Uciel. A few days later, Ronaldina was sitting on the floor of her office, sorting through boxes of papers. After some time, the girl stood up and complained to Lord Venedet that her back already hurt. To this, Uciel replied that he understood that she was busy, but it was cluttered here, even for her. Suddenly, Lord Clarat and his assistants entered the office, and when he began to read some document, one of them asked if he could make out what was written there. And when he answered positively, the assistant said that they came because they did not receive the report on time and offered to help sort everything out. At this time, the girl remembered the Emperor's thoughtful look and realized that she had been distracted. In her mind, she agreed with Lord Venedette, but at the same time she understood that she had a lot to do for Celsia. Ronaldina knew that Verica had sensed the princess's presence during the banquet. The girl understood that Miss Piff was lying low for now, but she didn't know when she would return. At this moment, Ronnie's name was called and she looked questioningly at the person who called her. It was one of the assistants who, handing her a stack of documents, asked her to take it. At this time, Lord Usiel pleased everyone that they could take the day off tomorrow since His Majesty had no scheduled business. And then, approaching Ronnie, he added that he should have told her about this in advance. The girl was happy because she would have gladly taken a day off. Looking out the window, Lord Venedette suddenly said that the air was damp and he had a feeling that it would rain. Ronnie, hearing this, suddenly asked if he was a frog, to which she received a negative answer. Sometime later, Miss Ronaldina was sitting in her room at the set table. The girl looked out the window and noticed that it really started raining. As she stood up, Ronnie realized that she liked the sound of the rain and decided to go for a walk. Having put on her shoes and gone out into the corridor, the girl went for a walk around the places she knew. She walked along the corridors of the palace, her shoes clicking their heels on the floor. At this time, the girl thought that it was strange that His Majesty was free today. And then, Ronnie suddenly noticed a light that was visible from the office. Entering there, the girl saw the Emperor sitting at the table. Thinking that he was really working at such an hour, Ronaldina called His Majesty. But when the man didn't answer, the girl realized that something was wrong. Coming closer, Ronnie noticed that the Emperor's eyes were closed and sweat was running down his face. His muscles were tense and his lips were pressed tightly together, but occasionally a groan would escape from them. Taking the Emperor's hand, which was lying on the table, Ronaldina realized that he was suffering from nightmares. Coming closer, the girl hugged His Majesty and pressed him to herself. Ronaldina hoped that his condition would not last long and that he would soon feel better. Bright stars were shining outside the window, and the girl stood and hugged the Emperor. After some time, Ronnie noticed that a blush was appearing on His Majesty's cheeks again. Then, sighing with relief that the man felt better, she stepped away from him. At this time, the Emperor opened his eyes and was surprised to see Ronaldina in front of him. The girl asked anxiously if he was okay. As he was trying to figure out what she was doing there at this hour, Ronnie interrupted him. And then, helping him to the couch and sitting him down on it, she said that he should not exhaust himself and Lord Wadenet worry terribly about him. The girl added that Usiel told her that lately the Emperor has not been sleeping at night and skipping meals. To this, His Majesty replied that he had always been like that, and also told that they first met when Evern was still a kingdom. His father brought him to the palace to keep the young prince company. Then the young lord followed Darren everywhere, and they often argued about this. The Emperor also told how often he teased Usiel, and about how often they got into minor troubles as children. His Majesty, telling this to Ronnie, was a little sad. At this time, to support the man, the girl took his hand. And then she admitted that it was hard for her to imagine how she and Lord Venedette got into trouble. And then the man noticed with surprise that he was reacting calmly to the girl holding his hand. And then Ronnie realized that it seemed the Emperor was no longer against physical contact. The next morning, Ronaldina walked along the corridors of the palace and looked around carefully. The girl realized that they needed to increase the budget to renovate the palace. Sometime later, Ronnie decided to ask Usiel a question, but he left. Then she decided to go to the office. The Emperor, seeing that the girl was leaving, asked where she went, and she answered that she went to the office. Arriving there, Ronaldina saw Lord Venedette standing in front of the shelves with books. Upon seeing the girl, the man asked what she wanted, to which she replied that she needed to see the expenses for last year's renovation. Usiel replied with a smile that they had done so much renovation last year that even he was at a loss. While Lord Venedette was looking for this information, he asked Ronnie how His Majesty was feeling, to which the girl replied that everything was fine. Unexpectedly, Usiel said that he didn't tell her why he gave everyone the day off yesterday. And then he explained that yesterday was the day of the death of the Emperor's mother, Lupetia. Usiel added that the Emperor always has a hard time on this day, and also, during this period, his seizures occur more often than usual. Lord Venedette then explained that on this day, His Majesty was taking a double dose of the medicine, and he himself was surprised at how quickly the year had passed. Usiel, not finding the documents Ronnie needed, promised to bring them later, and she, bending down to keep from crying, replied that she would go then. After that, the girl turned around and ran out of the office, and Lord Venedette shouted after her not to run. Ronaldina, at that moment, was thinking about why she became so sentimental when it came to His Majesty. And then the girl saw that the door to the Emperor's office was open. As she sped up, Ronnie realized she had forgotten to close the door. Looking into the office, the girl saw His Majesty, who was feeling ill, and Celsia, who was hugging him. The princess held His Majesty tightly to her chest. A few days later, in the office, seeing what the Emperor was doing, Uciel asked what he was doing. At this time, Miss Ronaldina just approached the door and was about to leave the office. But the Emperor's hand suddenly struck the door and closed it, causing Ronnie's surprise. And the man, standing opposite the girl, ordered her to stop avoiding him. At that moment, what Ronaldina saw flashed before her eyes, namely, the way Princess Celsia hugged the Emperor. And the girl did not understand at all why this had already begun. After all, it was still too early to treat His Majesty, and she did not understand why this surprised her so much. Then, closing the doors, she remembered the Emperor's thoughtful look, and then, with horror, she assumed that she had fallen in love with His Majesty. Last time, when the Emperor became ill at the banquet, Celsia left without a fight, and at that moment Ronaldina felt relief from this. But now, seeing how she was hugging His Majesty, Ronnie felt very bad and tears appeared in her eyes. Trying to calm down, the girl headed to her room. Melvin, seeing Miss Ronaldina, remarked that she had arrived too early today, and then, seeing Ronnie's condition, she anxiously asked what had happened. Lowering her head so that the maid of honor would not see her tears, the girl replied that she was not feeling well. When Ronnie, covering her face with her hands, added that she wanted to be alone, Melvin suggested that she lie down. Taking her lady by the hand, the maid of honor led her to the bedroom. After putting her to bed, Melvin added that she would tell the others that Ronnie was not feeling well. While packing her things, the maid of honor added that she slept better when she put her thoughts in order. Melvin added with a smile that she didn't know what was bothering her lady, but she would always be on her side. After wishing her a good rest and saying that they would see each other tomorrow, the girl left, closing the door tightly. There was a clock on the table next to the bed, slowly counting down the time. Ronnie lay in bed and thought that she was confused. The girl did not understand how it was possible to love a man who wanted to kill her and was shocked by her actions. Sitting up in bed, the girl realized why she had been so upset when His Majesty refused to hold his hand. But remembering that in the novella the Emperor and Celsia got married, she thought that you can't escape fate. Also, the girl was sure that one day she would cope with her feelings. And then a boy appeared in her thoughts, tugging at her skirt. He took Ronnie by the hand and led her along, and then she remembered that she had a dream. Ronaldina decided to quit as soon as she saved up enough money to realize it. Having put everything in its place in her head, the girl realized that she would start work tomorrow. Ronaldina made a decision for herself that she needed to keep her distance and avoid communication with the Emperor at all costs. The Emperor, some time ago, leaned back in his chair, rereading the same thing several times. But he didn't understand what was written there because he was thinking about why he tolerated Ronnie's touches. And the man also realized that he had begun to imagine something. Because of these thoughts, the man decided that he worked at night too often. The Emperor sat with his eyes closed and suddenly heard someone walking towards him. Having determined that these were female footsteps, the man suggested that it might be Ronaldina. He decided that he just needed to open his eyes to make sure of it. When the girl's hand touched his hair, the Emperor felt that something was wrong. His Majesty remembered that Ronnie had a calm, woody aroma. He opened his eyes abruptly and, seeing Celsia, asked what she was doing and what that disgusting, flowery smell was. At that moment, the girl removed her hand and turned to His Majesty. Celsia apologized for touching him, and the Emperor angrily asked who gave her the right to touch a sleeping man. He also noticed that the princess did not even knock, to which she replied that the servant accompanying her had left, and she was tired of waiting. The princess, looking miserable, admitted that she had been wrong. At that moment, His Majesty remembered how Uciel had asked him to be kinder to Her Highness. The Emperor, having said that he could not conduct negotiations for the time being, asked her to come at another time. As she walked towards the door, Princess Trumi turned around and said she was leaving, and the Emperor wondered if he was really waiting for Ronaldine. Assuming that he simply wanted to take advantage of her abilities to relieve him of pain, the man thought that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The Emperor was so immersed in his thoughts that he did not notice Uciel arriving, and hearing that he looked pale, was very surprised. Lord Venedette also warned His Majesty that Ronaldina would not be working today. Lady Model reported that she was not feeling well. Suddenly, the emperor said that this was getting on his nerves, and Yusiel, hearing this, asked if he was talking about him. But the emperor did not answer this question, but asked what was going on with the documents and mentally decided to avoid Ronnie at any cost. In the following days, whenever Ronaldina had questions, she would approach Lord Venedette with them, but he would invariably send her to ask the emperor. The girl understood that she would not go to him, so she always answered that she understood. And then, she invariably added that she could handle everything herself, which surprised the men. Yusiel understood that this happened when she started working. Even when the girl brought documents to the emperor, she put them on the table. There were notes made in the documents, although earlier Ronnie explained everything herself, and whenever the emperor asked her to make adjustments, the girl invariably found an excuse to leave. Yusiel once asked what His Majesty had done that made Ronnie start behaving like this, and then the emperor could not stand it and did not let the girl leave, although she tried to say that she had urgent business. Looking into the emperor's eyes filled with anger, Ronnie suddenly became afraid, and then turning away, a scream escaped her in fear. His Majesty asked in surprise if the girl had just screamed. And then Lord Vadenet approached them, and Ronnie looked at him with hope, and the emperor with anger. Yusiel, seeing these looks, decided to leave and leave them alone, wishing them good luck. But then, unexpectedly, the emperor removed his hand from the door. And then, leaving the surprised Yusiel and Ronnie, he went to his table. Lord Venedette asked the girl what had happened, because there was a feeling that the emperor was in a bad mood, but she did not know the answer to this question. And His Majesty sat down at the table, lowered his head and covered his face with his hand. At that moment, Ronnie suggested to Yusiel to return to the office because she needed to take care of something. When Lord Venedette approached His Majesty, he asked if he was really that scary since Ronnie screamed. And at that moment, Ronaldina was walking down the corridor and thinking about what was bothering her. Namely, that it was very close and the emperor realized that she was avoiding him. But the girl decided that they would not return to what was before. Here she wondered whether His Majesty would fire her for unprofessionalism. But for now, Ronnie couldn't afford to be fired because the palace paid well and she needed to earn more money to achieve her dream. The girl understood that even now, she had to keep her distance. After all, it would be easier to hide what she thought about him, Ronnie decided. Suddenly, she saw a girl walking ahead of her down the corridor. Looking closer, Ronaldina realized that it was Princess Celsia. Ronnie remembered that today she had a visit planned to His Majesty and decided that she should leave them alone. Lowering her head from sad thoughts, the girl thought that this way it would be easier. But then, unexpectedly, Ronaldina heard a loud cry from the emperor's office. Alarmed, the girl rushed to the office and burst into the open door. Ronnie saw how His Majesty firmly grabbed the princess by the shoulder. Then she, shouting to the servant that she would stay with the emperor, asked him to call Lord Venedette. Calling for Princess Trumi, Ronaldina ran towards her as fast as she could. In passing, she nudged the emperor to let go of Celsia. Having fallen with him, the girl asked if Her Highness was okay. The princess sat on her knees on the floor, tears frozen in her eyes. The only thing she could whisper was that she was very scared. Kneeling down next to Celsia, Ronnie took her face in her hands and said that everything was fine and help was on the way. Then she looked at Celsia and asked her to breathe with her. First inhale, then exhale. The princess, with wide-open eyes and tears streaming down her face, looked at Ronaldina. Then the girls heard the emperor's groan and saw him trying to get up. Leaving the princess, Ronaldina walked quickly towards His Majesty. And then, kneeling down next to him, she hugged him, saying that everything was fine and there was nothing to be afraid of. She asked His Majesty not to be afraid, but she herself wondered if Celsia hadn't cured him. At that moment, Yusiel ran into the office and asked Ronnie if anyone was hurt. The girl replied that His Majesty was fine and asked him to take care of the princess. Lord Venedette approached Celsia and, asking if she was okay, asked permission to help her. As she was leaving, the princess turned to Ronaldina and looked at her with eyes that still held tears. Ronnie, seeing this look, said that she would visit her soon. Sometime later, the emperor opened his eyes and was surprised to find himself embraced by Ronaldina. The girl told him that there was nothing to worry about because not a drop of blood had been shed and no one had died. At that moment, the emperor realized that Ronaldina had helped him again, and Ronnie, looking at the man, didn't know where to begin. Sometime later, two people were talking near the princess's chambers about how the princess was doing. It was Ronnie and Dr. Rigot. He told the girl that Celsia was not hurt thanks to her, but she needed rest. When the doctor was about to leave, Ronaldina asked where he was going, to which the doctor replied that he had a meeting with Watchern. The girl realized that since Rigot called the head of the delegation by name, they had become close, because they met every day to discuss medical research. Thinking that she also needed to focus on work, Ronaldina went to the princess's chambers. Seeing the girl, Celsia offered her a seat, which surprised her greatly. When Ronnie sat down, the princess took her hand, and when asked how she was feeling, she replied that everything was fine, she was just a little surprised. Hearing this, Ronaldina apologized for not being there. But Celsia suddenly said that she had to thank her, not as a representative of Austin, but as a person who wanted to thank her savior. The princess admitted that at that moment she was very scared, and she still hears Ronnie's voice, which led her out of the darkness. And then, smiling, Celsia asked the girl what she could do for her as a token of gratitude. Ronaldina looked at the princess in surprise, hoping that she had not fallen in love with her. Her Highness, strolling through the market and choosing something, remarked that she thought that it would look great on Ronnie. She added that she liked the design, but it might be too flashy. Ronaldina, looking at Celsia, who was bringing her various decorations, did not understand how it had come to this. The girl remembered how, during a conversation, Celsia said that she had heard that there was a busy market in the center of Nepra and asked to be taken there. And now, looking at the joyful princess, Ronaldina thought that there was a feeling that Celsia was comfortable with her. But the girl tried her best to concentrate. She wondered if it was she who felt something was wrong. Celsia suddenly noticed that Ronaldina was too serious. So she approached Ronnie and asked if she didn't like it here. The girl smiled and answered the princess that everything was fine, and then she added that she was very glad to spend time with Her Highness. Delighted by these words, Celsia suggested that they go somewhere else. The princess took the girl by the hand and, saying that it was a very good idea to go out today, pulled her to the side. Looking around, Ronaldina noticed that the streets of Nepra were lively, everyone had smiles on their faces, and the streets were literally filled with people. She suggested that perhaps the city's energy had thrown her off balance. After all, everything was completely different compared to the streets where Ronnie grew up. At this time, Celsia called out to her and showed her the cute toy she was holding in her hands. Ronaldina didn't understand what it was, a dog or a cat or maybe a bear, and was surprised that they were selling it. The saleswoman explained that it was a black panther, the symbol of Evern. The knight explained that Her Highness liked cute things and had a love for unique and original things. Ronnie smiled. She decided that everything was fine as long as the princess was having fun. But suddenly the girl noticed that Celsia became sad. Walking up to her and taking her hands, Ronnie asked what happened. Celsia suddenly asked the girl why she looked so bored next to her and so lively when talking to her knight. At that moment, Ronaldina realized what Her Highness felt, but the truth was that she knew their secrets, and Ronnie had no idea if she had any hidden motives. So the girl replied that she was simply not used to shopping and invited Celsia for tea, which greatly surprised her. Ronnie explained that she didn't need gifts. She would prefer to get to know each other better. Here the girl noticed that Celsia had attracted unwanted attention from people. So, smiling at Her Highness, Ronaldina invited her to have tea. Celsia perked up and said with a smile that she had seen a bakery nearby and suggested they buy dessert there. In her mind, Ronnie realized that today was simply not her day. Sometime later, Ronaldina was sitting at a table and looking out the window. For some reason, the girl felt awkward being at the same table with the princess. Celsia, who was sitting opposite Ronnie, thought that there was some kind of sudden silence. Ronaldina, looking at the princess, realized that she had returned to her usual calm, but even so, she seemed to want to say something. Therefore, the girl inquired about the fact that the princess was probably tired of everyone's attention, both here and at home. Smiling, Celsia replied that she thought it was because of the unusual color of her hair, and then suddenly said that Ronnie was beautiful. Hearing this, the girl decided to change the subject and said that she was worried that His Highness was not feeling well due to the change in the weather. But Celsia suddenly replied that they had simply returned to the palace. Ronnie, seeing the girl's sad look, wondered if something had happened and said that everyone has their own problems. Ronaldina also wanted to understand whether the princess had any hidden motives. Celsia suddenly looked out the window and thought, choosing the words to answer. Despite Ronnie, she added that the truth was that she had come here in the hope of seducing His Majesty. Hearing these words, the girl froze, her eyes wide open in surprise. Ronaldina, thinking she had misheard, apologized and asked again what the princess had just said. Celsia explained that she had been preparing for this moment for most of her life. She spent a long time learning to be as elegant and well-mannered as possible. As a child, she had no time to play because she was always busy with classes, and she was always and everywhere accompanied by the future knight. Therefore, Celsia added that only Igor, who was always with her, knew the real her. Her Highness added that she had to make sure that everyone saw her as an elegant princess. And when Celsia grew up, she realized that something was wrong with her life, and at first she tried to come to terms with it. At that moment, Ronaldina realized that she remembered this part of the story. And Celsia added that a few months ago, her parents confronted her with the fact that the time had come to go to Evern and seduce the emperor. With sadness, the princess said that all this was for the sake of the kingdom of Austin. Ronaldina, remembering the story, realized that it was true, and Celsia had not come here of her own free will. When Her Highness asked if she seemed foolish for allowing her parents to control her life, Ronnie replied that it was not true, and the princess added that she had never gone against her parents before. Her Highness explained that instead of seduction, she was simply dragging out the negotiations. Looking at Celsia with surprise, Ronaldina noticed that she loved her country very much. To this, Celsia replied that the girl was right, and her heart belonged to Austin and its inhabitants, and now Ronnie knew the reason for her being here. And then she asked the girl, after everything she had learned, if she felt awkward being around her. Ronaldina sat on the steps and thought that her conscience had always been crystal clear. The girl understood that she wanted to lead a safe and comfortable life. Ronnie also wanted Celsia to help His Majesty with his injury. The girl remembered that when they were drinking tea, she confessed to the princess that she was glad that such a kind person as she was next to His Majesty, and that Her Highness also treated his injury with understanding. To this, Celsia did not respond, but only smiled happily after her words. And then, the princess added that jumping to conclusions never brought any benefit. Ronnie remembered how thoughtful she had been as the carriage slowly returned her to the palace. Sitting in it, the girl understood that Celsia was a real mystery to her. But after a dialogue with her, Ronaldina was able to reconstruct individual fragments of the novella, and the girl was also sure that she would not see her after the tea party. Ronaldina understood that if Celsia's goal was to seduce His Majesty, then she simply needed to behave as usual. After sitting and thinking on the steps, the girl walked along the corridor of the palace, but suddenly heard her name being called. The princess caught up with the girl, clicking her heels, and asked if she was busy. Ronnie wasn't very happy when she heard Celsia's voice. She didn't even look back. And then, exhaling tiredly, she called the girl Her Highness. But Celsia asked not to call her that, since they had agreed to call each other by their first names when alone, although in truth it was the princess who insisted on it. For the past few days, Celsia had been following Ronaldina around, but she couldn't complain because she didn't interfere with her work. Looking at Ronnie's face, the princess suddenly asked if she was bothering her. Ronaldina was surprised by this question, which was immediately reflected on her face. But she told Celsia that she simply had nothing to say, to which the girl asked when she was planning to go to the shelter. And then the princess asked to take her with her, but Ronnie replied that she could not do that. Having a sweet look, Celsia promised to be careful, and added that she loved children and would be happy to go with her. Ronaldina didn't understand why the princess was like this, because from what she had read, she should be cool and considerate. Unable to resist Celsia's pleading gaze, Ronnie promised to tell her when she was ready to go to the shelter. Having hugged Ronaldina, the princess said that she would cook something for the children, and the girl realized that she would continue to meet with her even if she refused. With a smile, Ronaldina said that she had to go, and Celsia said goodbye, saying that they would see each other tomorrow. Watching the princess wave at her, Ronnie was surprised that she wanted to come again tomorrow. She waved back at Her Highness with a smile, saying goodbye. But when Celsia disappeared, the girl realized that all of this made her very uncomfortable. Remembering how the princess left, Ronnie understood that she needed to hide her emotions for His Majesty, but she also did not want to be friends with his future wife. Having reached the doors of the Emperor's office, Ronaldina froze in front of them, because in fact, the real problem was behind that door. Gathering her strength, the girl entered the office and stopped at the entrance. She saw that Usil was standing at the table with a thoughtful look, because recently His Majesty's condition had worsened. The medicine prevents him from losing consciousness, but the side effects still remain. The Emperor still has a very severe headache and hallucinations. And now, entering the office, Ronnie saw that His Majesty was feeling ill, and he, seeing the girl, thought that she always caught him when he was feeling ill. At that moment, Ronaldina was thinking that she needed to leave in time so that Celsia could save the Emperor. But everyone, including UCL, believed that only Ronnie could help His Majesty. The girl lowered her head and tried to stop feeling so guilty. The girl, pushing the door with her hand, said that she needed to return to the Department of Internal Affairs and went back out into the corridor. There, Ronaldina's strength left her and she sat down on the floor right next to the door. At that moment, she remembered Celsia's words, where she asked when Ronnie would go to the shelter. And then the girl decided that she needed to get there as soon as possible. Pulling her knees up to her chest and resting her head on them, Ronnie realized that she really missed her children. A few days later, Celsia stood with bags in her hands and asked Ronaldine what would happen if the children didn't like her. To these words, the girl smiled at the princess and replied that everything would be fine, and she had already sent them a message. After all, Celsia had prepared so many gifts for them that the servants were worried that they wouldn't all fit in the carriage. While everything was being loaded into the carriage, Ronnie stood and looked at the sky, and the wind played with her hair. She understood that there should be no complaints here, and then offered her help with loading. After some time, everything was ready, and Ronnie told Celsia that they could go. Upon arrival, the princess, with horror in her eyes, suddenly asked if they would hate her, to which the girl replied that the children would think that Christmas had come early this year. Sighing heavily and closing her eyes, Ronaldina added that the princess had no reason to worry. Suddenly, the gate opened slightly and a woman's face appeared, asking what all the commotion was about in front of her house. Seeing that it was Ronnie, she opened the gate wide and greeted her. The girl was very glad to see Modana, because they had not seen each other for a long time. She looked intently at the woman, and tears appeared in her eyes. And then Ronnie began to cry, and the girl who was standing next to Modana, seeing the gifts in the princess's hands, rushed to her. Then all the children ran out to meet Ronaldina, and when they saw the gifts, they asked if all this was really for them. Ronnie stood in front of Modana, and tears never stopped flowing from her eyes. Entering the house and going into the kitchen, the woman placed a mug of tea in front of Ronaldina and asked if she was feeling better. Sitting down opposite the girl, she added with a smile that she didn't know she missed her so much. Modana looked at Ronnie, who was drinking tea and trying to stop crying. And then, I seriously asked her what was going on. Ronnie responded to this by saying that she had fallen in love with someone, which surprised the woman. After all, before this, the girl had not dated anyone, and she also said that she would not look for a partner until she earned enough money. To which Ronnie replied that she was busy then, but Modana countered that now she was even busier. They looked at the girl with curiosity, trying to understand what had happened. And then the woman suggested that Ronnie was crying because she had been abandoned. In a rage, Modana asked who it was and whether she should curse him, but the girl thought that cursing the emperor was tantamount to treason. With her head down, Ronnie admitted to the woman that she hadn't yet told him how she felt. It was all because he was destined to be with someone else, and for Modana it was strange to hear about fate and love from someone who had been focused on making money all her life. Ronnie explained that she decided to keep her distance but help him with his problems. Modana also added that since that person is not yet with the one who is destined for him, then he just needs to be taken away. Clutching her head, Ronaldina said that they were made for each other. The woman realized that she did not understand Ronaldina at all. And then she asked why she was helping him, because it all sounded like Ronnie was trying to deny her feelings. She then explained that helping does not mean loving. If you help someone, that person may simply feel grateful. Modana stood up, walked over to Ronaldina and stroked her head. And then she told her not to worry, because the more she thought about it, the more she complicated and wound herself up. The woman hugged Ronnie, and she closed her eyes, because she missed hugs and a loved one so much. At that moment, the girl decided to do everything in her power to help him. Then Ronaldina, together with Modana, went downstairs, where the princess remained with the children. The children, seeing the girl, rushed to meet her and began to hug her, and she asked them not to attack in a crowd, but to approach one by one. Looking at Celsia, who was sitting at the table, Ronnie realized that she looked tired. At this time, Modana was pushing the children towards the stairs, saying that it was time for a snack. Ronnie approached the princess and apologized for leaving her alone, but she replied that she and the children had fun. Smiling and adjusting her hair, Ronaldina added that she was sorry she had left Celsia alone. She looked at the princess and didn't know what to answer if she asked why she was crying. But the princess, taking Ronnie by the hand, invited her to go and have a bite to eat too. At that moment, the girl realized that Celsia was trying to please her, and even though she couldn't help the princess, she liked it. A few days later, Ronaldina was sitting at the table for another tea party. The girl was tense, and this meeting did not bring her joy. After all, Verica was sitting opposite her and looking only in her direction. Ronnie realized that sometimes life leaves people stumped. After all, she only came to this tea party because Celsia insisted on her presence, and it was the princess who invited all these girls to today's tea party. Verica is the daughter of a former investor, and the lady sitting next to her is from a house known for creating exquisite jewelry. The two girls sitting next to each other are from families that make beautiful furniture and fashionable clothes. The next lady is from a family famous for its porcelain products. All the girls are from families known for business. The girls started talking about how the hunting festival would soon begin. They said it was a famous place located in the mountains surrounding Evern. This is a grand event where the spoils are evenly distributed across the different regions of Evern. The hunting festival is truly something special. Verica sat and listened, and suddenly one of the ladies asked whether His Majesty would take part this year. To this question, Ronaldina answered with a smile that she had not yet learned the Emperor's decision, but most likely he would take part again this year. The girls were delighted that they would see His Majesty at his best, and that he would become the best hunter again. Looking at the lady with a thoughtful look, Ronnie thought to herself that it was possible. At this point, Celsia suddenly asked if she could take part in the hunt. To this, Verica asked with a grin why the head of a foreign delegation wanted to take part in their hunt. She smiled and advised the princess to enjoy the show, just like all the guests, because they didn't want her to ruin the party with her injury. Ronaldina agreed with Miss Piff that if such a thing happened, it could cause friction between Evern and Austin, and therefore, she was sure that His Majesty would not allow Celsia to participate. But the princess, putting her hand to her chest, replied that although she was not a knight, she was a good hunter. To this, Verica noted that despite this, the girl could still end up a victim. Ronaldina would really hate for the Emperor to allow Celsia to participate, since in the novella she is attacked during the hunting festival. And when Ronnie heard the princess confidently declare that His Majesty would agree, she fearfully hoped that he would not accept the girl. A few days later, when Ronaldina came into the office, she saw Usiel sitting with his head down. He said that His Majesty agreed with the princess. Lord Venedette also added that Her Highness sent a letter to her parents yesterday. In response, the king promised not to hold Evern accountable if anything happened, and so the Emperor had no choice but to give in. His Majesty, Usiel, and Ronaldina were not delighted with this news, each clutching their heads, immersed in their own thoughts. Looking at the girl, Lord Venedette suddenly said that her eyes were now glassy like those of a dead fish, to which she sharply replied that now was not the time for jokes. The Emperor, noticing that they were busy with something they shouldn't have, asked why they were gossiping, since they probably had something else to do. And then, lightly massaging his neck, he added that they should get to work, as there was still a lot to discuss. Hearing these words, Usiel looked at the Emperor because he thought that he had softened, but later he became himself again. Looking at His Majesty holding his head, Lord Venedette assumed that this was the effect of the medicine, and also hoped that they would soon find a suitable medicine. And then, looking closely at His Majesty, Usiel realized that he might be upset. And then, looking at Ronnie, he decided that the Emperor was upset about something else. The girl sat at her desk, her thoughts occupied with the fact that she needed to prepare for the hunting festival. The girl understood that her task was to keep Celsia safe, and she carefully examined the plan of the festival site. But Ronaldina had no idea where the killers were, so she decided to attack the princess. She remembered that in the novel, Verica joined the Shadow Assassins Guild, and Lady Piff double-checked that there were enough people there to commit the murder. Remembering all this, Ronaldina realized that many people do not know about the existence of this guild. The girl found an album with a city plan because she remembered their location. And then, while no one was looking, she confidently pulled out the page she needed. Then the girl said that she needed to deliver the plan to the Royal Knightly Order. She knew she had to leave before His Majesty started grumbling again. Ronaldina walked confidently along the corridors of the palace, but her thoughts were far away. The girl thought about why she was putting in so much effort, since it was just a novella. She could always fly to another country if something went wrong and didn't understand why she was trying so hard to save all the characters. Ronaldina decided that she had gone too far to run away. And also, the girl, remembering the Emperor, realized that she had begun to protect him too much. But the plot simply indicates the direction in which to go. Having thought about all this, Ronaldina realized that there was no way out. So she followed the path written in the novel to the panther statue located in the center of Nirpa. There were pubs opposite the statue. She needed the third one from the left. At that moment, the girl felt like one of Verika's accomplices. She knew she shouldn't have come here, but she didn't have enough money to hire someone else. Ronaldina knew that it would cost a lot to cancel Verika's order. When Ronaldine entered the pub and sat down at a table, a waiter approached her and asked if she was ready to order. The girl, giving him a bag of money, asked him to bring her some beer. The waiter looked into the bag of money and thought for a while, and then he brought Ronald a mug of beer, under which he put some kind of leaflet. Then, wishing the girl to have fun, the man walked away from the table. Taking the piece of paper in her hands, Ronaldina realized that everything happened as described in the story. She gained access by ordering a drink and paying for it with 10 gold, 3 silver, and 5 copper coins. And on the piece of paper, they drew a map of a secret passage for her. Leaving the beer on the table, the girl got up from behind it and walked along the map. Ronaldina walked to the back of the slave, as that was where the secret passage was located. Having gone there, the girl saw a door that was disguised in the wall. Having opened it, she began to descend the steps, holding onto the wall. Ronaldina knew it was all a secret, but she had a hard time distinguishing things, so she came up against the door at the end of the stairs. The girl opened it and entering the room saw a table and a chair. Sitting down on the chair, Ronaldina thought that the furniture was no different from what was outside. Suddenly, a voice from the darkness asked her to tell her the purpose of her visit if she had finished looking around. Slightly frightened, Ronaldina gathered her courage and said that she wanted them to abandon the murder contract they had recently placed. Putting the bag of money on the table, the girl thought that this was her 2-month salary. The man hiding in the darkness opened the bag and looked at how much money was in it, and then he asked which order they should cancel on her behalf. Ronaldina explained that they had recently been commissioned to kill a blonde lady during a hunt and suggested telling the client that they had failed to complete the task. The man opposite suddenly asked if the girl was sure that this was exactly what she wanted. Ronaldina, worried by this question, asked what he meant, to which she received the answer that he was not sure that this was possible. The stars in the sky were shining, giving off their last light, and the sky was gradually getting brighter. Ronaldina, having taken off her cloak, slowly returned to the palace. The girl walked and thought about what the man from the Assassin's Guild had told her, namely, that they did not receive such orders. And then Ronaldina assumed that she had made a mistake somewhere and decided to ask the knights to keep an eye on Celsia. The girl suddenly stopped and looked closely at the building. She thought that from the outside, the palace was especially beautiful. And then she remembered that Celsia was very happy that Ronnie was joining her. So Ronaldina decided that everything wasn't so bad and the shadows weren't ordered to kill the princess. Then the girl's gaze rose to the upper floors of the palace and her eyes opened wide. After all, she saw a man on the balcony and realized that these were His Majesty's chambers. Ronaldina began running up the steps of the palace. Having run inside, the girl froze for a moment, deciding how to quickly reach His Majesty's chambers. She thought anxiously that she had to hurry and could not lose a minute. When the guards tried to stop Ronaldina, she simply asked them to get out of the way. And when she walked past them, she added that they could say that she had broken in herself. And then, already at the door, Ronaldina turned around and ordered that no one be allowed inside, otherwise she would write a complaint against them. Then, closing the door, Ronnie ran down the long corridor to the room where she had seen the Emperor. With an anxious cry calling for His Majesty, the girl burst into it. The Emperor stood on the balcony and Ronnie thought he was about to fall. So the girl ran up and grabbed him from behind with her arms, thinking that she couldn't let her guard down in this world. Having sat the man down on the floor and noticing that he was sleeping, Ronnie asked him to wake up. Trying to wake up His Majesty, the girl noticed that he looked weaker than usual. When the Emperor opened his eyes, Ronaldina noticed sweat running down his face and wondered what had happened to him. Watching the man suffer, the girl realized that she knew it would happen. Ronaldina blamed herself and considered herself a fool because she had to do something to help. Then the girl, kneeling, carefully laid the man on the floor. Placing her hand on his forehead, Ronnie thought that if she had done something, everything would have been much better now. The girl wondered if there was a way to get to the bottom of His Majesty's suffering, since she had found nothing in the archives. Ronaldina also remembered that she was able to piece the story together after Celsia's story, and if the Emperor told her his story, would it be possible to do something similar for His Majesty? She looked at the lying man, and various thoughts wandered through her head. She was very interested in what was happening in His Majesty's nightmares. Ronaldina wondered if there was a way to forget or overcome his trauma, and if there was more to the man's nightmares than what she already knew. Looking at the sleeping man, the girl did not expect an answer from him. Ronnie wondered if there was anyone in the palace who had been there long enough to know the details. Wiping the emperor's face, the girl realized that she no longer had the ability to give him temporary treatment. Ronnie really hoped that maybe there would be someone who could help the emperor. Having already arrived in her room and standing in front of the table, Ronaldina remembered that there was a person who could help, and after sitting down at the table, the girl resolutely began to write a letter. After all, Ronaldina remembered what the Duke had told her at the banquet about how the Emperor had gone through a lot in his youth. After writing the letter, the girl asked Melvin to send the letter to Duke Rampant as soon as possible. Taking the letter, the maid of honor realized that it was an urgent matter and then asked if Ronaldina had worked there before. Noticing that Melvin had a good memory, Ronnie said that today she would get ready herself. The maid of honor, leaving the room, asked the lady to make sure that she did not forget anything. When the girl left, Ronaldina thought with anxiety about how His Majesty was feeling, because he had already been informed about what had happened last night. Having got ready, the girl went to work in the Emperor's office. As soon as she opened the door, she smelled the scent of His Majesty's perfume and, entering, wished him good morning. Then the girl looked at Lord Venedette and asked why he came, since she told him to get some sleep. The man replied that this would be possible if she took care of the imperial finances. Then they each went to their own desk and got to work. Uciel, putting his head on the table, asked out loud whether this work would ever end. At this time, His Majesty, having finished his tea, put the empty mug on the table. Hearing the sound of the man putting down his mug, Ronnie looked at him. And then, deciding that the Emperor was in a bad mood again, she went about her work. After some time, thinking that she couldn't take it anymore, she laid her head on the table. The girl realized that she needed a break, and all because there was an error with the deliveries for the quarter. Looking at Lord Vedenet, Ronnie assumed that he had completely lost consciousness. And looking at His Majesty, Ronaldina saw that he had placed his hand on the table and was supporting her head. And with the finger of his other hand, the man nervously hits the table. The girl knew that the Emperor always did this when he had a headache. When she realized that His Majesty had a headache, she stood up abruptly. And then, calling out to him, she approached the Emperor's table. The man, hearing the girl calling him, raised his head and looked at her. Seeing Ronnie in front of his desk, the Emperor asked what had happened. The girl, extending her hand to the man, noticed that today was not the height of the banquet. His Majesty, folding his arms across his chest, looked at Ronnie with incomprehension, and she, unexpectedly for the man, suddenly took his hand in hers. Seeing this, even Lord Venedette raised his head from the table, and Ronaldina, holding the Emperor's hand tightly, asked permission to be of service. Watching His Majesty with concern, the girl realized that he was not against her proposal. In her mind, Ronaldina prayed for the Emperor to get better. Looking at the man's face, the girl thought that the blush would soon return to his face. Suddenly, there was the sound of a door opening, and the Emperor, pulling his hand out of Ronnie's hands, placed it on the table. The valet entered the office and, apologizing, reported that he had come to deliver a message. When the girl asked who it was for, the servant replied that it was for His Majesty's secretary, from Duke Randus. Taking the paper in her hands, Ronaldina was very surprised that his answer had already arrived. In it, the girl read that the Duke would be able to find time for her today and asked to let her know when she could come. At this point, the Emperor, turning to his valet, remarked that if there had been something urgent, the Duke would have sent a messenger. He also added that if his lordship wanted to receive an answer by mail, the servant should wait until their working day was over. The valet apologized to His Majesty, and Uciel and Ronnie explained that he was simply in a bad mood. Then Ronaldina looked at the letter again and thought that the Duke's answer had come earlier than she expected. The girl hoped to be free early today to pay a visit to his lordship, and she succeeded, so after some time she got into a carriage and went to the Duke. On the way, the girl looked out the window because a lot of time had passed since she last enjoyed this view. As the carriage pulled up to the Duke's mansion, the girl sheepishly wondered if it was too rude to arrive on the same day as soon as she received the letter. When Ronaldina got out of the carriage, she heard her name being called. Turning around, the girl smiled joyfully because she was met by the Duke himself. And he, together with his son, stood near the gate, and the young man, waving his hand, called her to them. The girl happily greeted the Duke and Geraldino, noting that they had not seen each other for a long time. His lordship noted that Ronnie was not one to hurry and most likely had arrived on important business. Sitting down at the table, the Duke asked her what had happened and allowed her to ask what she wanted. Smiling back, Ronaldina said she had questions that only he could answer. Looking down, the girl added that she wasn't sure where to begin. And then she asked if he worked in the royal palace when Evern was still a kingdom. The man answered positively, and then thoughtfully added that when he looks at His Majesty now, he regrets having left there. Ronaldina, hearing this, asked his lordship to tell him what had happened in the palace during his stay there and what the emperor had gone through. After looking closely at the girl, the man replied that it was a complicated story. And then he added that he had never met a man who suffered as much as His Majesty. Evern became an empire thanks to the emperor, but 30 years ago they were a small kingdom. The Duke added that he was unaware of the problems until he succeeded his father and began working at the royal palace. At that moment, the man remembered the scene where the queen accused her husband of infidelity and asked if he didn't feel sorry for his own child. She also talked about the gossip in which people said that the king did not respect his queen. The Duke said that the former king of Evern was only interested in satisfying his own interests. The situation worsened after the birth of Crown Prince Duran. The queen cried constantly and was left alone. Rumors and gossip undermined her spirit. And the king drowned in alcohol and women and completely stopped paying attention to his family. The woman was constantly sad and could not hold back her tears when looking at her little son, and the prince had only his mother on whom he could rely. One day, young Duran joyfully ran into his mother's chambers. When he called out to her, the queen turned around, tears streaming down her cheeks. She stood barefoot on the balcony, her hair loose. The Duke added that it was on that day that a tragedy occurred that shook all of Evern, and all this happened before the eyes of the young prince, who was in his mother's room. The newspapers then wrote that Her Majesty Lucretia had fallen to her death, and the crown prince witnessed the death of his own mother. Ronaldina listened in horror as the Duke described what had been a terrifying experience for the young boy. The king gradually went mad and blamed his young son for his wife's death. He told him again and again that it was Darren who was to blame for his mother's death. It was then that the Duke left the palace to continue his life as a businessman. And the king continued to verbally insult his son, and the Duke was sure that he did this to ease his guilt. Already sitting in the carriage on the way home, the girl recalled that his lordship had said that His Majesty ascended the throne after his father drank himself to death. And already approaching the palace, Ronnie remembered that the Duke admitted that he could not return to the palace, and Darren was left completely alone and even took care of himself. Looking at the palace, which was illuminated by the stars, Ronnie decided that it looked melancholic. She looked up at the upper floors, afraid to see the emperor again on the balcony. But when I saw that it was empty, I hoped that His Majesty was still there. The girl understood why he suffered from PTSD, because in order to forget the past, he had no choice but to become a workaholic, pushing himself to the limit. This was the only way to forget about fear and pain. Walking through the corridors of the palace, Ronnie began to remember some details of the novel apparently. The Duke's story provoked this. Then she noticed that the light was on in His Majesty's office and realized that it always burned brightly. Looking in, she saw the man working and realized that he was doing it to forget himself, because physical labor is better than mental pain. At that moment, His Majesty raised his head and saw Ronaldina with surprise. At that moment, the girl was thinking that, despite his traumatic past, the man was giving his all to protect Evern. So, slightly embarrassed, Ronnie apologized and said that she had not intended to come. The Emperor, hearing these words, was very surprised and looked at her questioningly. And suddenly, quite unexpectedly, tears began to flow from Ronaldina's eyes. Covering her mouth with her hand and saying that she must have forgotten herself, the girl wanted to leave. Covering her face with her hands and turning towards the exit, Ronnie suddenly heard His Majesty ask her to stop. Stopping, the girl thought that she knew she couldn't help him. She introduced Celsha, who approached Darren and asked how he was feeling. When the Emperor told the princess that he was feeling better, she smiled happily. And at that moment, Ronaldina suddenly felt His Majesty's hands on her shoulders. Looking at the girl with concern, the Emperor asked if everything was all right with her. And at that moment, Ronaldina imagined a man telling the princess that without her he would go crazy, and that now he felt like he could breathe. The girl was sure that only Celsia could heal him. Covering her face with her hands, she tried to stop crying. But the man still held the girl tightly by the shoulders, and she suddenly realized that he was comforting her. Ronaldine felt very awkward and she asked herself to stop crying. Pulling herself together, the girl cleared her throat and told His Majesty that she did not want to disturb him. And then, taking hold of the door handle, she said that she needed to go. But the Emperor suddenly said that she looked like she had trouble with her balance and suggested that she sit down, which surprised Ronnie. Turning away from the girl, the man added that he didn't mind. Then he walked to his desk, sat down and began looking through more documents. Ronaldina, standing still, looked at His Majesty and thought that he had returned to work again. Then the man asked if the girl had decided to accept his proposal. Ronaldina answered positively and, going up to the table, sat down opposite the Emperor. Suddenly the man stood up from the table and Ronnie looked at him questioningly. And then I mentally wondered if he really wanted to sit at his table. But the Emperor simply took the teapot and mug and returned back to the table. Ronaldina, seeing this, offered to make tea, but His Majesty, pouring tea into a mug, said that everything was already ready. Then they sat opposite each other and calmly drank tea. After a while, Ronnie said that she probably should go. And then, looking at the Emperor, who was still looking through the papers, she noticed that he was mechanically massaging his head, and the girl realized that he had a headache again. Then Ronnie stood up and walked around the table, taking the man's hand, to which he asked if she sometimes forgot that he was the Emperor. Smiling, Ronaldina replied that he had given her permission earlier, and saying that she knew it would only help for a short time, asked him to be patient with her for a little while. Sitting down next to His Majesty, Ronnie noticed that his hands were always cold and suggested that the man had problems with blood circulation. Then she suggested that he do exercises and sit less at the table. When the girl said that His Majesty should eat better, she asked if he was listening to her, to which the man replied that he was not deaf. Ronaldina then pointed out that he should look at others when he was talking. Unexpectedly, their eyes met and the girl, embarrassed, quickly changed the subject. She said that she had heard that the princess would take part in the hunt, to which the Emperor replied that this would only be on one condition. Ronaldina lowered her head and wondered what this condition was. The Emperor explained that if Her Highness wins, she will ask for help for her country. But this will not happen anytime soon, the man added. Ronaldina responded by noting that Celsia had been practicing with a sword since she was young, so she could win. But His Majesty replied that this would not happen because his hunting skills were unmatched. Then Ronaldina, having said that the hunting festival would be held in the Imperial Palace, asked whether the Emperor would take part in it. Taking his hand from the girls, the man replied that he would be the winner and that he had made the rules, so he didn't care about participating in the festival. And then the Emperor explained that he had started this festival so that he would have a reason to go somewhere. Looking at the man, Ronnie realized that it was difficult for him to go anywhere because of PTSD. The festival not only shows the world how things are going, but also provides food for the inhabitants of the empire. And most importantly, it gives the Emperor some room to breathe. The girl felt very sorry that he couldn't walk in peace. Therefore, Ronaldina, taking the man's hand in hers again, suddenly asked if he would like to freshen up a little. His Majesty looked at the girl in surprise, not understanding what she meant. Smiling, Ronnie explained that it was late, but they had some moonlight. But the Emperor suddenly lowered his head and asked the girl to wait. And then he admitted that he didn't want to go out. Or rather, he couldn't. And then he added that Ronaldina knows the reason for this. At that moment, the girl asked His Majesty if he could still hear voices and see dark shadows unfolding before his eyes. And then, lifting the Emperor, she added that he had said that all this would disappear if he held her hand. Still holding the man's hand, she told him to just follow her and led him out into the garden. Looking around carefully, the Emperor noticed that he had not seen all this so close for a long time. Ronaldina, watching His Majesty, thought that although he was now hardly talking, she was sure that he was now enjoying the silence. And the girl was also happy that the man felt comfortable. The Emperor, looking at Ronnie, suddenly thought that he was glad that they had come out. He walked and thought that he had had a terrible nightmare. But when the man opened his eyes, he saw Ronnie next to him, who apologized. And lying on the floor, the Emperor looked at the girl and did not understand why she was asking for forgiveness. But the man realized that it was Ronaldine's voice that made the shadows disappear. He tried to remember their faces through his blurred vision, but her face appeared before his eyes. The Emperor also remembered that Ronnie was scared of him, so he focused on work. At the same time, His Majesty always watched the girl from afar. But suddenly, Ronaldina started to behave strangely. The Emperor remembered how the girl took his hand and, saying that it was not the middle of the banquet, asked permission to be of service. And today, Ronnie, late in the evening, came to his office. The Emperor was very surprised when he saw the girl. He could not help but pay attention. And when Ronaldina suddenly started crying, the man was completely at a loss. After all, at that moment the girl was very sad. But then, after some time, Ronaldina suddenly began to smile. The Emperor walked through the garden and looked at the girl, remembering all this. Holding Ronaldine's hand, he couldn't understand what was going on in her head. Addressing the girl by name, His Majesty asked if she was cold. When Ronnie replied that the evening was cool but everything was fine and it was much nicer in the gardens at night, the man thought that this did not seem true. But he himself, with surprise, asked why this was exactly so. Ronaldina replied that the garden was beautiful when the sun was shining on it, but no less beautiful under the starry sky. The girl bent down and picked some flowers that grew along the path they were walking along. And then, looking at His Majesty, she asked if he really didn't agree with her and asked him to look around. The Emperor, looking carefully at the garden, agreed that she was right. Looking at the flowers along the path, he noticed that his mother also loved such flowers. She preferred the flowers in the garden to those the young Emperor picked for her. He remembered that sometimes they walked together in the garden, and the man also realized that a lot of time had passed since he last enjoyed the scent of flowers. So he told Ronnie that he liked everything, and then asked if he talked too much. The girl replied that she liked listening to him, and they walked around the garden for some time. Ronaldina suddenly told the Emperor that she was always happy to help. And then, looking at the man, she asked him to let her know if he needed her help. Meanwhile, a single candle burned in the dark room, and someone was outraged by the news that the girl had asked to reject the order. It was Verica who was talking to the representative of the Assassin's Guild. She was interested in how Ronnie found them. But the guild representative replied that he himself did not understand how she could find them and find out the details, and he also said that he replied that he did not receive such an order. Verica placed a jewelry box on the table and explained what kind of information she wanted to receive. The man remarked that he understood that this was too much even for them, but Lady Piff interrupted him, saying that the value of these stones was 3 times the value of their contract. When Verica was about to terminate the contract, the man agreed to fulfill it and provided the girl with the information she requested. After this, Lady Piff got ready to leave, reminding the man not to forget the details of their contract. After all, their target was not a blonde, but a girl with straw-colored hair. The next morning, the palace was in full swing as everyone gathered for the hunting festival. The teams collected medical supplies in case of various injuries. The girl, walking to the office, thought that the sun had just risen, but everything was already in turmoil. Looking at the Emperor, who was sitting at the table, Ronaldina noticed that he was dressed from head to toe. Holding out her hand to His Majesty, she said with a smile that they were clean. Involuntarily, the man reached out to her hand with his own. Ronnie remembered that since that night in the garden, she had been offering her services to the Emperor. Sometimes the girl noticed Uciel staring at them. She also noticed that Lord Venedet sometimes teased them, but His Majesty ignores him, and Ronnie follows his example. Suddenly, the Emperor pulled a watch out of his pocket and, looking at it, said that it was time to go. Ronaldina realized that a lot of fuss and work lay ahead of them. After all, the moments of calm were behind us, and the hunting festival had begun. Having changed into a riding suit, the girl went out into the clearing. As Ronnie was wondering why it was so clear and bright, she heard Celsia calling her. The princess, standing near her tent, waved her hand and called Ronaldina. When Ronnie approached, Celsia hugged the girl and said that she was very glad that she would be there during the hunt. Then the princess asked if Ronaldina should not be at the opening ceremony next to the Emperor, but the girl explained that the man had given her permission to be next to the princess. But since His Majesty was participating in the hunt, the opening ceremony was being held rather unusually. And Verica, who, as usual, was sitting at a table next to the ceremony venue. Ronnie would have liked to sit and enjoy a cold drink, but Celsia was also participating in the hunt. So, clenching her fists and plucking up her courage, the girl approached the princess. And then she sat on the horse behind Celsia, even though she was very scared. Looking at the green grass, Ronnie was afraid that they would fall off their horse. Ronaldina was terrified and wondered who came up with this idea of riding a horse, and also that you need to go hunting on horseback. Closing her eyes and wrapping her arms around the princess's waist, the girl thought about this, and also about what will happen if she falls from a horse. Will she die from it? Ronnie thought she should have been on her knees begging to watch the hunt from afar. After some time, the horse stopped in one place, shuffling its hooves with impatience. Looking back at Ronnie, Celsia said it had been an easy walk and warned her to get ready for the hunt. Ronaldina, horrified by the thought, said that the princess was a good rider, to which she replied that she had been training since childhood. Celsia added that she would have seated her with the knight if she had known that Ronnie was riding a horse for the first time, and then offered to ride with Igor. Trembling with fear and closing her eyes, the girl answered positively. After all, Ronaldina was very afraid of falling off her horse. Turning around and breathing a sigh of relief, the princess called out to the knight, for she sensed Ronnie's fear. Igor sat the girl in front of him, and they slowly rode behind Celsia, who was carefully examining the surroundings. The knight, sensing Ronaldina's fear, asked her to hold on to her tighter. The girl, sitting on the horse, did not understand why she should suffer because of Verica. At that moment, the princess noticed some movement in the child and pulled her bow. And then, Celsia released the arrow and realized that it had hit its target. The knights who accompanied them were delighted to see that their princess had hit the target in one attempt and hoped that they might win the hunt. Ronaldina, however, looked around the area, trying to notice anything suspicious, but saw nothing. She closed her eyes and silently prayed that nothing would happen today. At this time, Igor, noticing how the girl was holding the reins, showed how to hold them correctly. Then he asked her if she wanted to go where everyone was, but Ronnie just asked why everyone was happy. Suddenly, the knights who were standing near the slain animal began to notice that the arrow was somehow strange. Celsia, who had come up to them, noticed that it was not her arrow and thought it strange that the deer had fallen. One of the knights objected that he didn't see anyone nearby, which meant it was the princess's arrow. He asked with surprise who else besides her could shoot an animal from such a distance. At this time, the emperor was riding on the trail of the deer he had shot and asked to tell the judge to write it down. Having followed the tracks into the clearing, His Majesty was surprised to see the princess with her retinue and Ronaldina, who was sitting on a horse with Igor. When the emperor called the girl by name, she turned around and was surprised to see him there. His Majesty asked what she was doing, and Ronnie, thinking that she was always glad to see him, replied that he had given her permission to accompany Her Highness. To this the emperor remarked that he had no idea that Ronaldina did not ride, and then promised to teach her when the hunt was over. Hearing these words, the girl was very surprised by the man's promise. At this time, the judge got off his horse and apologized, saying that he needed to check the type of arrow. Ronaldina became interested and said that she also wanted to see Igor. Hearing this, dismounted and helped the girl get down. As she approached the slain animal, Ronnie couldn't stop thinking about the emperor's promise to teach her to ride, all because the girl did not understand what had come over His Majesty. Suddenly she noticed that Igor had fallen behind and asked why he was standing so far away. To this the knight replied that he did not want to fall into someone's disfavor. At this time, the judge pulled out the arrow and noticed that there was a panther engraved on the tip, and it belonged to the emperor. Having received the judge's verdict, His Majesty prepared to leave to continue the hunt. But then the man heard the princess call out to him. Celsia, having caught up with His Majesty, asked if he had forgotten about their agreement. But the emperor asked them not to talk about this topic anymore because they did not need gossip, and advised them to try anything because he would still be the winner. Hearing this, Celsia replied that even if she didn't win the hunt, there was always a backup plan. Without turning around, the emperor asked the princess not to speak in riddles. Deciding that it was time for them to go too, Celsia asked Igor to help Ronnie mount his horse. Mounting her horse with the knight's help, Ronaldina realized that something had happened between the princess and the emperor. She looked at His Majesty, who stood surrounded by his men. At this time, Celsia called her people and added that it was time to return. The horses moved slowly along the path, and the princess apologized to Ronnie for dragging her into something else, to which the girl replied that she wanted to go herself, and added that Her Highness was an amazing huntress. Ronaldina, looking at the darkening sky, thought that she was afraid of what might happen, but now that it was all over, she felt relieved. There was a pleasant breeze blowing, and the girl realized that she even enjoyed watching Celsia and the knights hunt. And just when Ronnie was beginning to guess why the emperor held a hunting festival every year, the horse reared up. And thinking that everyone had returned safely, the girl began to fall from her horse. Taking her eyes off the floor, Ronaldina realized she was in bed and the room smelled of medicine like a hospital. The girl wanted to remember the end of the hunt, but then she heard Celsia asking her how she was feeling and explaining that the doctor had given her a sedative and painkiller. Ronnie didn't understand what had happened and why she wanted to sleep so much. The girl remembered how they were returning from hunting and then, hearing a strange sound, the horse reared up. She tried to remember in detail that moment and how she fell, but whenever Ronaldina tried to do this, she kept getting distracted. Looking at Celsia, the girl tried to understand why she was so worried. Then Ronnie saw His Majesty enter the room and was surprised. After all, the man looked very broken, although she was the one who suffered. Ronaldina decided to calm the Emperor and said that everything was fine, and that she had simply fallen off her horse. But looking at His Majesty's face, the girl realized that she had done a poor job, and then, extending her hand towards him, she apologized for ruining his hunt. And Ronnie also thought that she shouldn't have interrupted the Emperor mid-sentence. She understood that this was the only day when His Majesty could feel free outside the palace. At this time, Celsia quietly told the Emperor that Ronnie was sleepy because of the sedatives and needed to be given some rest. The Emperor covered his face with his hand. It was hard for him to look at Ronaldina, who had suffered so much. He remembered that at first he was simply interested in how the girl could calm him down, and then Ronnie started to keep an eye on him more and more. And after that, His Majesty began to realize that he was becoming closer to her. Sometimes, because of Ronaldine, his schedule was a little disrupted. The Emperor knew he should be upset, but he felt that this was not the case at all. And right now, standing by the bed on which the girl lay, the man realized that he was experiencing different feelings. And also, the Emperor suddenly realized that Ronnie needed to take more care of himself. His Majesty did not understand what he would help her do, and whether he should confess his feelings for her. The man remembered how Ronaldina smiled joyfully when she could be of use to him. In despair, the Emperor did not understand how this could happen to her. At that time, Dr. Rigaud was sitting in the living room with the princess and her knight. The doctor knew that the Emperor did not like it when his men were injured, and he was interested in how he would react. Suddenly, the princess asked Rigaud if it had been planned. To this, the man replied that this was most likely the case, since the bomb was planted on a slope in order to accurately damage the target, since in the mountains it would have been more difficult. At that moment, everyone heard the door open, and His Majesty entered the room. When the doctor approached the Emperor, he asked how Ronaldina was, to which Rigaud replied that she had fallen from her horse but had not broken anything. Holding his head, His Majesty asked whether he had understood correctly that the girl had been injured by a horse, to which he received a positive answer. The princess and the knight approached the Emperor and asked what had happened. His Majesty, hearing this question, demanded an explanation from them. To this, the princess replied that most likely an explosion occurred on the way back. She added that the explosion was small, but enough to frighten the horse. Celsia explained that Miss Ronaldina lost control of the reins and was thrown from her horse. The Emperor, his eyes flashing, said sharply that they knew that Ronnie had not ridden horses before. And then he added that they should have kept better watch on her. Igor, hearing this, bowed and apologized, admitting that it was his mistake. At that moment, the Emperor rushed towards the knight and grabbed him by the neck. In shock, the princess and doctor standing nearby asked His Majesty to let him go. Sweat was running down the man's face as he tried to restrain himself from killing Igor, and Rigaud was asking him to wake up. A moment later, the Emperor released the knight and grabbed his head, thinking that this had nothing to do with his feelings. At this time, Igor was trying to clear his throat, and the princess suddenly said that she agreed that he was responsible, but the blame also lay with the imperial palace, which had chosen the mountains for the hunt. Unexpectedly, the Emperor agreed to this, which greatly surprised Celsia. Turning away, he apologized to the knight for losing his temper and asked Rigaud to take care of Igor. Already closing the door, His Majesty told the princess that they would talk about everything later. Left alone in the corridor, the Emperor, with his head down, thought about something. The princess asked what had just happened, to which the knight replied that he was still alive. Sometime later, the commander of the knights came to the Emperor's office and reported that the sand at the site of the explosion had been burnt, and they had found the remains of a bomb at the scene. His Majesty, hearing these words, asked whether they were aimed at anyone in particular. To this, the man replied that they assumed they wanted to hurt the princess, and neither they nor the Austinites had found the criminal. Enraged, the Emperor stood up and angrily asked how they dared to do such a thing during an imperial hunt, and ordered that they be found. With a bow, the commander was about to leave, but then His Majesty ordered the knights to gather in the training hall. Hearing this, the man was scared, but thought that now they were ready for this. Meanwhile, in the chambers, a woman's hand grasped a vase with the intention of breaking it. It was Miss Piff, whose maid asked her to calm down so as not to get hurt. Suddenly, the princess approached the maid and asked her to leave it with her and to return only when she called her. Verica was very irritated, but Celsia asked her to stop being angry, or better yet, to sit down, because they needed to talk. In despair, Miss Piff accused the princess of not saying this would happen. Celsia, however, watched Verica with interest, smiling slyly, and then, adding a little surprise to her voice, she asked if she had really said such a thing. Verica responded by noting that Celsia had said that Ronaldina would be seriously injured and would have no choice but to quit, but the injuries turned out to be minor. And then Miss Piff, clutching her head, added that she had spent a lot of effort on the guild, but they still did a shitty job. She noticed that the princess said that she would help and asked why she didn't help. Pointing her finger at Celsia, Verica said that it was she who came to her first, so she could always tell His Majesty who was behind this. And the princess better make sure she keeps her end of the bargain. After hearing all this, Celsia suddenly said that she thought they needed to take another step. With a wild smile, the princess added that Ronnie was returning to the orphanage where she came from to look after the children. To this, Verica asked not to call Ronaldina by her nickname because it irritates her. The princess, noting that she could say whatever she wanted, added that now the emperor was looking everywhere for the culprit, so they needed to act slowly. As she passed Verica, Celsia said that she simply needed to wait for her signal. Then she walked towards the exit of the room, leaving Miss Piff standing there thoughtfully. And then a thought came into her head related to the children from the orphanage, and she smiled ominously. At that moment, Celsia confidently said that she would fulfill the terms of the agreement. And having already opened the door, she asked Miss Piff not to bother her. Outside the windows of the room where Ronaldina was sitting on the bed, the sun was shining and birds were singing. The girl smiled, because over the past few weeks she had not worked, but lay in bed and admired the scenery. But at the same time, Ronaldina was very bored doing this. After all, every day the girl did the same things and looked at the same landscape outside the window. Therefore, Ronaldina wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. She remembered Usiel's words, who said that it was calm here, but chaos was happening outside. Lord Venedette came to see her from time to time, and he also told her what happened while she was lying down. The Emperor is still looking for the man who did it, and the Imperial Knights have been reprimanded for incompetence. The girl remembered that Usiel had told her more than just this. Most importantly, Lord Venedette said that His Majesty is not very well and his condition has worsened. Ronaldina thought that the Emperor probably felt terrible about that incident and was up to his neck in work without her. She remembered that His Majesty came to her only once, when she was taken to the infirmary. Ronaldina closed her eyes and remembered the face and smile of His Majesty. And then I realized that I really missed a man. Suddenly it dawned on the girl what she had just thought about. And then she decided that she needed to focus on something else, because she would soon be discharged. As Ronaldina stretched, she suddenly felt a strong pain in her shoulder. And then she remembered that Dr. Rigaud had warned her that it would continue to hurt. The girl realized that she could return to work, but she had to be careful, and she was also very interested in why the criminals used the bomb. After all, in the original story, the killer tried to push Celsia off the cliff. Ronnie also realized that the guild most likely knew who she was referring to when she mentioned the blonde. After all, in the original story, the author emphasized that blonde hair was Celsia's characteristic feature. Thinking about what the guild had told her, that no one had made such a request, and that in the end there was a bomb, the girl did not notice how someone came to her. Ronaldina suggested that it might be another guild that she knew nothing about. At this time, the princess called out to Ronnie because it was she who entered her room. Ronaldina was delighted by the princess's visit, and smiling said that she was glad that she had come. Celsia replied with a smile that she hoped Ronnie would get better. And then, the princess suddenly added that she felt ill every time she was in the infirmary. The girl added sadly that everything that happened to Ronnie was her fault. But Ronaldina did not agree with her, because Igor told her to hold the reins, but she could not resist. And then, Ronnie added enthusiastically that she was already feeling much better and would soon be discharged. To this, Celsia said with concern that the girl was still in pain and asked if she would be able to return to work, to which she received a positive answer. Ronaldina added that recovery will take another 3 weeks. Hearing about such a period, the princess suddenly thought for a moment. Ronaldina looked at the girl with a smile, not understanding why this information made her think. And then, unable to bear it any longer, Ronnie waved her hand in front of Celsia's face and called her name. Then the girl asked if something was wrong, to which the princess replied that she was simply doing some calculations. Then Celsia leaned over to Rani and suddenly stroked her cheek with her palm. Ronaldina only looked questioningly at the princess in response, not understanding her actions. To this look, Celsia replied that she hoped that Rani would get better soon. The month that Dr. Rigaud gave me for recovery flew by quickly, and now the dresses and writing materials were ready. Ronaldina, dressed and ready for work, looked at herself in the mirror. Melvin, who was standing next to her, noticed that Rani looked great and asked her not to get injured like that again, to which the girl promised to be more careful. And already leaving the room, she added that she was simply happy to return to work. Smiling happily, Ronaldina waved to the maid of honor and said that they would see each other later. After some time, the girl entered the emperor's office and saw him sitting at the table. Clutching the folder of papers to her chest, Ronaldina wished him good morning. But the emperor did not answer this and continued to look at the piece of paper he was holding in his hands. Ronaldina slowly walked up to her desk and looked at His Majesty, thinking that he didn't even look up. This made her sad, because they hadn't seen each other for quite a long time. The girl understood that this was a one-sided love, but she could not do anything and felt disappointed. At that moment, Yusiel called out to her, approached her table and asked how she was feeling. Rani, seeing the pile of papers in his hands, asked if he really wanted to give her all of it, to which the man replied that it was one of the busiest times of the year. He added that they needed to prepare for tomorrow's administrative meeting. When the girl looked at the papers, she was surprised by the topic of discussion. Yusiel explained that they needed to study all the materials he had collected, as they showed problems and ways to solve them. While Rani was looking through the documents and deciding that she should start with the legal documents, the emperor asked for more tea. Yusiel went to bring His Majesty fresh tea. Ronaldina, seeing how the emperor rubbed the bridge of his nose, realized that he had a severe headache. The girl stood up and, approaching the emperor's table, called out to him and touched his hand. But unexpectedly, the man did not let the girl take his hand, which surprised him greatly. And then His Majesty asked not to worry about him and to get down to work. When he said this, the tone of his voice was very cold. And for Rani, it was strange, because the emperor's voice could be indifferent, but it was never cold. The girl did not understand at all why he started to behave like this. She wondered if it was because she had been absent for a month, or because of something she had said at the hospital. Rani had so anticipated returning to work, but now she felt like her heart had been cut in half. The next day, everyone gathered in the hall for an administrative meeting. And contrary to Ronaldina's hopes, the officials asked about the same topic over and over again for several hours. The emperor, tired of hearing this, suddenly asked whether it was necessary to have a legislative act. The officials suddenly fell silent and looked at His Majesty. And at that moment, Rani thought that, most likely, everyone decided that the new bill would be the most effective way to stimulate the growth of the empire. The girl understood that her hands were simply itching to propose, because something had been bothering her for a very long time, and today's topic made her think about it. But Rani knew that no one would support her proposal, so she didn't know whether to propose it or not. At this time, the emperor asked Yusiel what he thought, but he did not know what to answer. And then His Majesty looked at Ronaldina and asked what she thought. The girl stood up and decided to try to put forward her proposal, since this was not something she could handle alone. Placing her hand on her chest, Rani said she had something to offer. She decided not to get nervous and tell it like it was, and began by reminding everyone that she was from the slums. Ronaldina said the slums are full of people who cannot work and children abandoned by their parents. The girl said decisively that many people think that children on the streets have no brains, but judging from what she saw, it was quite the opposite. After all, there were smart children there who wanted to study, and the girl suggested creating an academy where such children could study. Ronaldina explained that the current academies are too expensive for such children, but if they open an academy, they will have a chance. But in response, Rani heard only the indignation of the officials, because it would have been free of charge. Some people asked the girl if she knew how much it cost to open an academy from scratch, and she agreed that it was expensive. After all, an academy, unlike a school, offers its students a variety of courses, so the building must be of considerable size. And that is precisely why they needed government funds for this. After all, Rani can open an orphanage with his own funds, but he can never open an academy. One of the officials asked why they should train them from the very beginning and spend taxpayers' money on them. Ronaldina objected that this could be the case if they only slept and ate. And then she added that by doing this, they were investing in the future of Evern, whose citizens would swear allegiance to their country. The girl explained that the academy would only accept children who agreed to work for the empire after completing their studies to pay for it. She added that this means that after training, the palace will be able to send them to work in places that the palace needs. Someone suddenly asked that even if they create an academy, what if some do not want to study hard? It was a good question, to which Ronaldina replied that they would need to introduce some rules. The girl explained that tests and exams should be introduced, based on the results of which it would be possible to expel lazy students and then focus on their studies. Yushio looked at Ronnie with approval, knowing that this was too good an opportunity for them to miss. The emperor watched the girl carefully but said nothing yet. After Ronnie had said everything, she thanked everyone for listening to her. The emperor asked those who agreed with the girl's proposal to raise their hands, and Ronnie herself, closing her eyes, prayed that they would give the children a chance to get an education. The girl understood that this would be a chance for a new life for children from the slums. She looked at the officials talking and dreamed that the children would think about the future instead of living in the present. When everyone had voted, the emperor noticed that 3 people agreed with her proposal. Ronaldina realized at that moment that she knew it wouldn't work. But the girl decided not to give up and to prepare better for the next time. Unexpectedly, she heard the emperor say that her idea was not bad at all. When everyone looked at His Majesty in surprise, he added that there would be those who would disagree with this, since they had never had free academies for the poor. Hearing the emperor's words, the officials began to justify why they did not vote. To this, His Majesty remarked that their words meant nothing without evidence. And then, turning to Ronaldina, the emperor said that if she wanted to convince everyone, she needed to come up with a reliable proposal. Then, standing up, he added that they would hold another meeting on this topic when his secretary had collected the relevant materials. When the emperor left, the girl looked after him for a long time, and the officials discussed her idea. Yusiel, on his way out, stopped near Ronnie and said that he was eagerly awaiting her proposal with evidence. Smiling back, Ronaldina thanked him, and the girl also understood that she had a chance. She knew that coming up with a concrete plan would not be easy, but this did not frighten her, because she could create the academy of her dreams. A huge stack of paper fell onto the table with a loud sound. Ronaldina, who brought her, thought that she was up to her ears in work, and was also preparing a project for the academy. Melvin, who was standing nearby, noticed that Ronnie worked a lot and needed to rest after work instead of doing business. Then the maid of honor reminded the girl that she was going somewhere tomorrow. Hearing this, Ronaldina asked her to prepare something convenient for tomorrow. Melvin promised to do everything and, saying that they would see each other tomorrow, got ready to go to her room. Ronnie waved goodbye to her maid of honor with a smile. With the thought that she needed to finish the work before she could rest, the girl sat down to write. She decided that she would do this tonight and add the information tomorrow after she went to the slums. Ronnie remembered that she hadn't been in the slums for ages. She didn't go there because she felt guilty seeing children on the streets, but now she has found a way to help them. Having decided that this would definitely work, Ronaldina suddenly realized that something was missing. Specifically, the girl couldn't find the book anywhere, although she clearly remembered that she had taken it with her. After searching everything, Ronnie assumed that she most likely left it in the emperor's office. Looking at her watch, the girl realized that it was already late, but she knew that His Majesty was still working and did not want to run into him. Ronaldina remembered that she couldn't muster the courage to talk to him after he pulled his hand away. The girl had no idea why the emperor was behaving this way, but she had no choice because she needed the book, which meant she had to go to the office. Thinking that her main task was to finish the report, Ronaldina left the room. After some time, the girl reached the office and stood hesitantly in front of it. Then, plucking up her courage, Ronnie finally reached out to the door and went inside. His Majesty was sitting at the table in the office. Hearing the sound of the door opening, he looked up from the documents. Then he saw Ronaldina frozen in the doorway and looked at her. At that moment, the girl realized that their eyes met because she was also looking at him. But a moment later, the emperor let go of his head and began looking at the documents again. Ronaldina realized at that moment that this was precisely why she didn't want to come. After all, the girl's heart began to ache every time the man avoided eye contact. Ronnie, trying not to reveal her thoughts, approached the table on which the forgotten book lay. Taking it in her arms, the girl, looking back at the emperor, went to the door, thinking that she hoped that they had become closer, but now he seemed even further away than when they first met. After all, His Majesty was still sitting at the table, not taking his eyes off the papers. After this, the girl approached the door and left the emperor's office. As she walked down the hallway, Ronnie assumed the man was probably suffering from headaches due to the medication, but she didn't notice him frowning. And she was curious whether the emperor was holding back the pain or had truly recovered, since she had not seen him suffer and would have been glad if he had recovered. Remembering the meeting, Ronaldina did not understand why he helped her, because he should have ignored her, because if he wanted to help, he should not push her away. The girl realized that His Majesty did not want her help, but at the same time he did everything for her, and she realized that he needed to stop rushing from side to side. And then Ronnie decided that if the emperor didn't want it, then she wasn't obligated to help him, and decided to pretend that he didn't exist. The next morning, the girl called a carriage and told the coachman where she wanted to go. Melvin, who saw her mistress off, wished her a safe journey. Ronnie went to the slums because she understood that it was impossible to prove to officials that the children from there were worthy, since they never received an education. Donning her hood, Ronaldina decided she needed to convince the officials that investing in these children would be beneficial to the empire. Getting out of the carriage and walking down the street, the girl noticed that nothing had changed in the slums. Seeing the boy running into the alley, Ronnie realized she knew this place. Looking around the corner, the girl remembered that she lived right there, in the shelter. After all, it was to this house that she built that she brought the orphans, and now it has become a home for them. Approaching the boy who was sitting on the path with wooden blocks, Ronnie asked if he was building a house. He stood up abruptly upon hearing this question, but the girl calmed him down as she didn't want to scare him, and offered him some candy. When the boy asked why she was giving them to him, Ronnie replied that she wanted to ask him and his friends a few questions. The girl explained that she was not a bad person and it would not take much time. Entering the house, Ronaldina pulled out a piece of paper and a feather and told the children surrounding her that she would give them a treat if they answered a few questions. Smiling, Ronnie asked if they didn't have to think about survival, what they wanted to be when they grew up. And the children, with smiles on their faces, named many professions that they would like to have when they grow up. Ronaldina asked them to answer one by one because she couldn't keep up at all when they all spoke together. So, turning to the gloomy boy she saw first, she decided to start with him. He looked seriously at Ronaldine and suddenly replied that he wanted to become an architect. After some time, having asked all the questions and handed out treats, the girl left the shelter. As she walked down the street, Ronnie decided that next time she would bring them food and blankets. After all, Ronaldina understood that bringing treats was not enough, and they needed an institution that would protect children, like a state academy. A few days later, everyone gathered for another administrative meeting. Ronaldina stood up and said that she had prepared a report on the academy they had talked about at the last meeting. The officials, not expecting such swiftness from the girl, prepared to listen attentively. And Ronnie, with a smile, asked them to take the documents lying in front of them. In these documents, the girl presented statistics proving that the academy would be useful for the growth of the empire. Uciel was surprised to see a post about a child who made a homemade lift to help a man who fell into a manhole. The officials said they had heard about it and even read about it in the newspapers, which made Ronnie smile. She added that this child dreamed of becoming an inventor, but ended up becoming a farmer. And then, Ronaldina said that if such a child had a chance, he could become the greatest inventor, and she also attached articles with similar stories to the report. The report also included surveys she conducted with children in the slums, and these children all knew what they wanted to become and why. These children have ambition and will be willing to learn, and their educational growth will benefit the empire. Ronnie went on to say that on the last page, there was a budget for the establishment of the academy, tuition fees, and the profit the empire would receive once they started working in the public sector. Officials noted that the initial costs were quite high, although the proposal was much better than they expected, and decided to hold a vote. Sometime later, Ronaldina walked out of the conference room and sighed with relief. And then she smiled happily, because this time she succeeded. Ronnie remembered that there were only 2 votes against, but the rest voted for her proposal, and now she was going to consult with the royal architect. All because the emperor said that since it was her proposal, it meant that she should oversee this project. He added that Lord Marvel oversaw the construction of a private academy, so he would be able to help her. Reaching the doors, Ronaldina looked in and asked if Lord Marvel's office was located here, to which she received a positive answer. Entering the office, Ronaldina introduced herself and added that she was the emperor's secretary. The girl also said that she had drawings of the building she planned to build and a letter with the emperor's approval. After seeing the drawings, the architect asked if she had drawn them herself and suggested discussing them. The man then asked where the building would be built, and Ronnie replied that Lord Venedet had offered a site, but they would need to inspect it. Ronaldina also asked if Lord Marvel only accepted orders from the palace, to which the man replied that he accepted orders from outside when he was free. And if the girl doesn't mind waiting, then he can take on another project, which made Ronaldina very happy because she wanted him to design another building. She showed the architect the drawing and said that she had bought the plot. When the man started talking about the cost, Ronnie was afraid that she might not have enough money because she had spent a lot on the assassins' guilds. And then the girl asked if she could pay half in advance and the other half when the work began, to which she received a positive answer. This answer reassured Ronaldina, as she would have enough time to collect the missing money. The girl thought that His Majesty would recover from the injury in a few months, and she would resign. After this, Ronnie told the architect how she wanted the academy building to look. After a few days, the girl realized that now that she was in charge of construction, she was even busier than before. One day, when Ronnie entered the conference room, she saw the princess, who asked if she was going to work now. The girl, while preparing the papers, realized that today was the day of negotiations. Celsia looked at Ronaldina and asked why she was so busy lately. When Ronnie got ready to leave, the princess grabbed her hand and said that she could work here. When Celsia didn't accept the girl's refusal, she thought the princess had completely ignored her. At this time, the emperor entered the conference room, holding his head with his hand, and Ronaldina realized that he had a headache. Therefore, she decided to stay just in case His Majesty needed her help. And so the negotiations began, but then suddenly Celsia asked if he had managed to find the culprits of the explosion. After all, a lot of time had passed and she hadn't received any news, and besides, Celsia had heard that the royal guard was feeling the pressure. The emperor, looking at the princess, asked her not to change the subject and to return to the negotiations. But Celsia, smiling, replied that in her opinion they were still looking for the criminals. Then, looking sad, the princess added that she had seen bruises on Ronaldine's body and hoped that His Majesty would find out who did it. Hearing this, Ronnie asked when she could have seen them, to which she received the answer that she saw them when she visited her in the infirmary. Realizing that the emperor did not know this, Celsia was very surprised and noted that she had not seen them together for a long time. To these words, His Majesty did not respond, but only looked at Her Highness. And then, suddenly, he said abruptly that they needed to stop chatting and focus on the negotiations. Hearing this, Ronnie thought that the man did not care about her well-being, and although her hands were shaking, she decided not to be upset. But the princess did not miss the fact that Ronnie was upset, and she was thinking about something. Looking at Celsia, the girl suddenly realized that she didn't look worried about her at all. At this time, the emperor, noticing that Her Highness did not seem interested in the negotiations, suggested ending them. And then the princess added that today she wanted to offer something different, which surprised Ronaldina. The girl didn't know that they were still discussing the details and thought that at this rate, the negotiations would never end. And Ronnie also thought that it wouldn't matter if Celsia married His Majesty and cured him of PTSD. Upset by her thoughts, Ronaldina decided to focus on her work. She decided to quickly do everything and go to bed. But against her will, the girl spent a lot of time doing work, and all because she could not get the emperor's words out of her head, and as a result, she became very tired. Melvin, who met her in the room, asked if Ronnie had done her job well, to which she received a negative answer and offered to bring her something sweet to cheer her up. Having asked her lady to rest, the maid of honor ran out of the room, saying that she would return soon. When Melvin ran away, Ronnie kindly wondered what she should do with the girl's boundless energy. Having decided to lie down, Ronaldina realized that she liked the fact that the maid of honor was taking care of her. Suddenly, the girl heard some sound from the door and looked around. Ronnie was scared and hesitantly asked who was there, but no one answered her. But someone was still there, because a note was carefully slipped under her door. When she picked it up, Ronnie smelled a familiar scent and decided that someone she knew wanted to play a joke on her. But when the girl opened the note and read what was written in it, her eyes widened in shock. After all, there was only one phrase in it. Someone unknown wrote that he kidnapped children. After reading the note, Ronaldina did not immediately understand what was written in it. After all, the only children she knew were the children from the orphanage. Tears glistened in the girl's eyes at the thought that they had been kidnapped, and she tried to calm down. Ronaldina decided that she needed to find out what was going on, but then the terrible thought that something might happen there while she was planning here took hold of her, and tears were already running from her eyes from the thought that the children could be killed. Deciding that she couldn't allow this to happen, the girl ran out of the room. In the corridor, she collided with a maid and fell to the floor, frightening her. Anxiously, the girl extended her hand to Ronaldine to help her up and asked if she was okay. Ronnie stood up and walked on, the thought beating in her head that she needed to find a carriage. Suddenly, she saw a carriage standing at the porch and realized that someone had recently gotten out of it. Running up to the course, she asked to be taken to the village of Van Alf. With tears in her eyes, she convinced the coachman that she needed to go there right now. The girl really hoped that nothing had happened to the children. Sitting in the carriage, Ronaldina tried to calm down and think clearly. But the closer they got, the more anxiety overcame her. But then the carriage turned, and the girl saw children who were on the street. Ronnie didn't see their faces, but she was still happy, because most likely these were children from her house, since there were no other children who could be on the street at this time. The girl decided to find out everything herself and asked the coachman to stop. But the carriage continued to move, and the coachman did not react to Ronnie's words. When the coachman drove past the house, the girl wondered where he was taking her. Thinking that something was wrong, Ronaldina tried to open the door. When it didn't open, the girl realized that the note was meant to lure her out and decided to break the glass. Thinking about getting out of this carriage, Ronnie hit the glass with her elbow several times. Meanwhile, the Emperor was suffering from a headache, which greatly worried UCL. He understood that His Majesty had been in pain for an hour already and suggested that he turn to Ronaldine. But the Emperor wanted to handle it himself and did not want to disturb the girl. He thought that Ronnie would be in danger if she stayed with him. His Majesty thought that staying away was the only way to ensure Ronaldina's safety, and, looking at UCL, asked if he was looking for a new secretary. He added that he had asked to find someone who could start as soon as the academy was built, to which Lord Venedette replied that there were many candidates, but none were suitable. In fact, UCL didn't even bother to make an announcement. He didn't understand why the Emperor kept his distance, since they cared about each other. Lord Venedette did not understand at all why His Majesty was trying to complicate everything, and suggested out loud that Ronaldina treat him until they found a cure. When he added that they would simply ask her for help, he suddenly heard a sound from the door. Approaching them, UCL asked who was knocking on the door at such an unholy time. Then the door opened and Lady Modella burst into the office. It was clear that the girl was running. Catching her breath, she asked him to look at what she found in Ronaldina's room. Tears rolled down her face, and she added that she didn't know which children the note was talking about, but Ronnie disappeared after she read it. Melvin said she waited a long time for Ronaldina, but she never returned. The Emperor, who took the note, realized that if there was no address, then the culprit knew where she would go after reading it. The man also realized that the girl was in danger, and he also came to the conclusion that since Ronnie couldn't ride a horse, it meant that she had called a carriage. The Emperor ordered UCL to gather the staff and find out if anyone remembers which carriage left the palace, and there might also be a spy among them, so the palace security must be strengthened. Lord Venedette remembered that Ronaldina was caring for several orphans, along with a childhood friend. His Majesty, having heard that the house was located in the village of Van Alf, wanted to quickly leave the office. But suddenly, UCL grabbed his hand and told him that he couldn't go. He explained that they did not know what the culprit wanted and added that His Majesty could not go alone. When the man ordered him to let go, UCL grabbed his hand and said that he couldn't do it. He added that they would send the knights first and that he would not tell the exact location until they did so. The Emperor, having calmed down, agreed with Lord Venedette and said that he could let him go. After UCL released His Majesty, he looked at him with irritation. And then, slowly, without turning around, he walked towards his desk. Sometime later, the Chief Chamberlain entered the office. Seeing the Emperor barely containing his anger, the servant was very surprised. And His Majesty ordered that everyone be gathered in the palace, brought there, and that the carriage that